May 13th, 2013. It's a day that people that live in this rural area will never forget, ever.
All right, what do you need to tell us?
I don't want to say that I'm crazy, but I'm just, just hearing stuff. The voice would tell me to do this and do that.
So what kind of things were these voices saying?
To kill somebody.
They have a spree killer on their hands. Wherever he happens to be is where he might strike again. And we don't know where that is.
Nobody knows what's going on. Why is he doing this? Who is he targeting?
The garage door was open, then I walked in. I shot the lady first. And I shot the old man in the front of the head.
The body count is going to continue to rise. Where is this son of a...
And then I just went blank. Then I shot him.
Some crimes occur, make the evening news.
We now have the identity of all 5 victims.
And then don't survive the 24-hour news cycle. And there are some crimes that people are never able to forget. And this is one of them. It's around 7 a.m., and Marcia Longfellow is worried. She's been trying to call her friend Ellisir Graham for quite some time and hasn't been able to reach him, and that, she thinks, is very unusual. So she goes to the gas station where he works, but he's not there. And then she notices fluttering newspapers in the wind, a short distance away from the station. She walks closer to investigate and sees something on the ground. What is that? What she finds is Ellisir Graham, half naked and dead, and so it begins.
I'm David A. Frankel. I'm a retired Washoe County Sheriff's Office detective in Reno, Nevada. When I got hired, after a couple years, I rotated into an undercover role where you follow the worst criminals around, and you really got an eye into how the criminals think, what they're doing. Criminals always throw curveballs, so you just got to keep an open mind and think out of the box. On that day, we got notified of a body out off of Interstate 80, and there's not much out there. I remember seeing like newspapers all over, and then the body was kind of in an area just off the road and seemed to be covered by a blanket.
The briefing deputies tell Frankel that the victim is 51 years old. His name is Ellisir Graham, and he works at that particular gas station a very short distance away.
The body was found at the I-80 Mustang exit. It's very familiar to people because the Mustang Ranch is at that exit.
The Mustang Ranch is a brothel about 15 miles outside of Reno. It has been there for a long time.
The Mustang Ranch, it's a popular place. You're wondering if it's related to that.
Prostitution encourages the arrival of an unsavory element in society. It waves a red flag. It says, come here and do as you wish. Come on down. You're the next contestant, and the customer is always right. The deputy coroner and Frankel together respond to look at the body.
His pants are pulled down and his shirt's pulled up. He appears to have some sort of injury.
The deputy coroner does a closer examination of the head, and he discovers 3 small caliber gunshot wounds. The general position and the indication of the body is he was killed recently, overnight, less than 12 hours. There's no evidence of a struggle, no defensive wounds. He has money in his wallet. So why is he undressed? Does the shooter want to humiliate him so when he's discovered he's naked? It could be anything.
Mr. Graham's body was found 100 yards or so from a gas station that he also worked at. We did talk to people at the gas station.
The employees say the last time they saw Elazir was last night when they closed and they all left for the evening. And there's certainly nothing out of the ordinary in this gas station this morning. There's no robbery. They say he has a truck. So where is it? They don't know. It's always important to search the surrounding area from a crime scene to determine if other evidence can be discovered. And as those investigators fan out to search the area, Detective Frankel goes to speak with the relatives of the victim.
So I was at work, and then they told me that my brother was murdered. I just didn't believe it was real. Because I had just talked to him, I just got my Mother's Day gift. You know, how is it possible? But that's it. It was right in this stretch where he was killed. And he was found here, up there. When I came, there was still blood markings over there by the stop sign. This is my brother, Ellie. You can't see it in this picture, but Ellie had a crooked smile, you know? It looked like a Popeye grin. When I was growing up, there was 15 children. My dad was a pig farmer. And I think Dad and Ellie were like mud on a pig. They were inseparable. The two of them loved the hogs. He had multiple jobs. The gas station, the mission, the newspapers. He worked for the mattress company. I don't even know when he slept, but he kept it all up. He'd always help somebody. When somebody needed something, oh, go to Ellie. He can help you. Who do you rely on when your reliable rock is no longer here? When they told me that Ellie was murdered, I thought Frank killed him.
The sister believed that Mr. Graham's brother, Frank, may have killed her brother. They had an ongoing dispute that was pretty toxic.
Detective Frankel goes to see relatives for the very purpose of trying to develop a suspect. And this family handed him a suspect on a silver platter. At 7:30 a.m., the victim, Elazir Graham, was discovered dead near the gas station where he worked. And now investigators are looking into his own brother as possibly the killer.
When they were kids, Frank and Ellie were very close. They were like two peas in a pod.
She said they will never talk about it, but something really bad happened between them, and neither one forgives the other.
Tension between Frank and Ellie grew. For 20 years, they had their rivalry.
In the prior few weeks, there had been an incident where Frank may have tried to run his brother over with a car.
She said Elazir was visiting his parents at the family home, and the brother decided to come by as well. And when that happens, there's always going to be trouble. Frank allegedly announces he's going to kill his brother by running him over and attempts to do the same. When your blood runs hot, Whatever is convenient becomes a weapon.
I just remember Ellie just saying, you know, my leg's messed up. I'm like, are you okay? Yep. And then the police were called.
But Elazir wouldn't pursue anything, so the sheriff's department drops the charge.
Immediately you're thinking we might have a really good lead, so you definitely have to go check that out.
There's nothing more dangerous than a feud that goes on for 20 years, and then a recent event where it escalates. It gets more hateful by the minute. They find Frank, bring him into the office for interrogation. He is hostile. He is angry. He finds it to be ludicrous that they think he would kill his brother. And they say, well, why not? You tried to 2 weeks ago. Finally, he says, look, I just got into town. I've been driving a truck for weeks. He's an over-the-road trucker. They check with his employment, and that's true.
We were able to verify that Mr. Graham's brother, Frank, was not involved in his murder.
He's just a brother who doesn't like his dead brother. But that's all he is. So it's back to square one.
You just have to reassess any other information you can get and keep tracking down people with connections to the victim.
Now it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and Frankel hears back from the officers searching the crime scene area where they discover a pickup truck in a ditch along I-80.
You certainly have to go look at it because it's in the vicinity of where the body's found and see if there's any connection.
They search the truck, assuming it belongs to Mr. Graham, and they don't find anything of any interest. So they run the plates, and they discover it belongs to someone else entirely.
It came back to people with the last name of Pape, and they lived in Fernley, Nevada, which was in the next county over. It's what we call a cow county, meaning it's a lot of farmland. It was a pretty peaceful little town.
Robert Pape is 84 years old, and he lives with his wife, Dorothy. And his truck is abandoned within a quarter mile of the murder scene. Now, why is that?
Did they see anything, or are they involved? You have to keep an open mind of it could be any of the above.
He may be 84 years old, but all it takes is 6 pounds of pressure to pull a trigger.
First thing we do is call the police department in that jurisdiction and ask them, hey, can you make contact with the Papes and ask them if they know anything about their vehicle being out here at the Mustang exit.
And the officer that answers the phone says, boy, that's amazing. We found his house on fire in Fernley this morning.
That was pretty alarming, like, what's going on?
The 911 call came in at 5:30 this morning. When the fire department responded, they discover a pickup truck in the garage was on fire. The fire had also spread to the house. The firemen went in to clear the house, but found no one home. Robert and Dorothy Pape are not in this house.
I felt that it wasn't this crazy coincidence. A light bulb went off. These might be linked together.
What is going on here? Something is.
So we responded out to Lyon County in the Fernley area where the other crime scene was to see if we could help with anything that they needed.
My name is Marty Dews. I was a detective for the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. When the Washoe County Sheriff's Office calls us, we're now looking at possibly sitting on a piece of evidence for their case. Everybody was kind of getting extremely confused. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together oddly.
Things are going through your head, like, was Mr. Graham involved in something at the Pape's house? Did he steal their truck?
We know that the fire department responded to a truck on fire in the garage. They assume it is a truck belonging to the resident, Mr. Robert Pape. However, at 7:30 in the morning, Robert Pape's truck is 20 miles away So then the question becomes, if it's not the Pape truck, then whose truck is it?
When the police in Lyon County ran their records check, that truck came back to our victim, Mr. Graham. It's like, what the heck is going on here?
This just gets more confusing by the moment.
There must be some kind of connection. And also, where are the Papes?
Are they in the house? The fire department says no.
The fire department goes in, puts out the fire, and they make a sweep of the house. So we were basically taking it at their word. And it was myself and the fire marshal who were talking. And we're both kind of like, are we sure we checked the house good?
Fire departments are good at putting out fires. They're not very good at searching places. You train detectives to be thorough and detailed and overlook nothing.
So we did a greater walkthrough of the house.
With a structure fire, the entire house is covered in soot. It's understandable why people overlook things, because it's a mess, filthy mess.
When we did go into the master bedroom, the bed had been stripped. There was a weird substance on the floor, just like squiggles on the carpet. It looked like shampoo. It was really weird. It kind of threw us off. When we got to the walk-in closet, something was just, they just call it JDLR. It just doesn't look right. Most of their clothes were hung up, but then there's these two huge piles of clothing on the ground, like somebody just emptied out a dresser and just threw it on the floor. Then we started just peeling back some of the clothes. And then all of a sudden, it was just like, I think we got a problem.
You find what you've been looking for. 2 dead people. Detective Dave Frankel and Detective Dews of the Lyon County Sheriff's Department find 2 dead bodies, an elderly man and an elderly woman. They confirm the identity of these 2 people, and they are, in fact, Robert and Dorothy Pape.
We have 3 bodies. The Papes are dead. Mr. Graham is dead. What is going on?
In Lyon County, we're all deputy coroners in the sheriff's office. So we were like, okay, we need to start switching over to coroner mode and crime scene mode.
Mrs. Pape had been shot in the head, and Mr. Pape had been shot in the head and torso.
Small caliber bullets, just like Alisher Graham. Now we know this is connected, and the same shooter is involved in all of this mess. There is some evidence of decomposition, which says this didn't happen this morning, this happened a few days ago, and so they are first. Mr. Graham is victim number 2. What is the purpose behind that? Detectives continue their search, and they find 2 locations, the obvious spots where these people were killed.
More than likely, Dorothy's laying in bed, and Robert Pape's laying flat on his back on the floor.
So somebody moved those bodies post-mortem. Now, why did they do that?
The Pape's house appeared to be like a ransacked residence. Jewelry seemed to be gone. Other things that would lead them to believe this might have been a burglary gone bad.
To have this kind of violence associated with theft and burglary is very rare.
We did a greater walkthrough of the house. Now I start seeing indications that are throwing me off. There's a full cookie sheet of freshly cooked bacon. It's just sitting on the counter.
They find half-eaten food. You have a guy who kills and then decides to live there with his victims because they're decomposing 2 or 3 days worth. He's eating a pizza with dead people.
Extremely creepy. Extremely.
And while they're working this scene, the relatives of Dorothy and Robert Pape arrive, and they inform him of their death.
I go screaming up the driveway in my car, and I jump out, and this guy in a suit comes running up to me. I asked him, "You're a fire detective or something?" And he goes, "No, I'm a homicide detective." He puts his hands on my shoulder like this, and he's holding me, and he goes, "We believe that they've been murdered." And I'm like, "What? What do you mean they've been murdered?"
They asked who they might have known that would have done this.
They'd said a lot of people know the Papes, and nobody had a bad word to say about him.
Murder never, ever crossed my mind because everybody in that town loved him. This is Bob and Dottie's 50th wedding anniversary. They celebrated just the two of them because in their minds, that's all there was. You never saw one without the other. Bob and Dottie were married 63 years. Bob was in the U.S. Army, and he was in Korea for 2 years, and he had a Purple Heart. And then Bob's career was in the Drywall Tapers Union. Dottie was a stay-at-home mom. She had like 5 miscarriages trying to have children. And so Bob and Dottie pretty much gave up on ever having any children. And then she got pregnant with my husband. We were, the 4 of us, a very close family.
With the Papes being deceased in Lyon County and Mr. Graham being deceased in our county, and the coincidences of their vehicles being at opposite scenes, obviously we're thinking there's some kind of connection.
They asked, did your mother or your father know a man named Elizur Graham who worked in a gas station 20 miles away on I-80?
And I went, absolutely not.
So it certainly gives one the impression so far that these victims were connected at random.
It puts a lot of pressure on you because obviously your body count's going up quickly. Is somebody going on a killing spree? Do we have a serial murderer? Are we going to find more bodies?
Your assumption is great, that this person isn't through killing. He likes it, and wherever he happens to be is where he might strike again. And we don't know where that is. Now it's 11 a.m. Both agencies have been placed on high alert. The Lyon County Sheriff's Department gets a phone call to check the welfare on Angie Duff. This is a neighbor of the Papes. Detective Dews can see that house from where he's standing.
They said the female that owned the house would volunteer at the senior center, and she was a no-call, no-show that morning. We sent 2 street deputies. Well, they get there, and there's no answer. One of them went around back. And the back glass had been shattered, and there's glass everywhere.
He's looking through that window and sees the absolute worst thing he could see. The fear was he would strike again, and he has. It's a little after 11 a.m. on the same day, and they discover 2 more dead bodies, a man and a woman.
All of a sudden, that's 5. Our body count's going up.
There's no longer any doubt. This is one person. They're on a killing spree. Anyone they encounter, they're going to kill.
That's when the pressure ratchets up pretty high.
When they gain entry to the home of Angie Duff, they examine the house.
It's a chaotic crime scene. Actually, it was more like a combat zone. She was fighting for her life. There's blood everywhere. It's all over the carpets, it's on the floors, it's on the walls. I can honestly say it's the most bloody non-suicide I've ever seen.
The victims are identified as Angie Duff and her companion, Lester Lieber. Both have been shot to death with small caliber bullets.
Lester also had a very evident knife cut into his chest.
Now we have two weapons involved, perpetrated by the same person. Maybe we're now really enjoying the violence, hard to say. But it's an escalation.
So now what's the motive? Nothing is taken, nothing's rattled through, the cars are still here. And I have had a serious fight in this house with firearms and a bladed weapon. It's like it's calculated, but it's random at the same time.
So they're looking at these bodies, and then they realize the blood is very fresh. This just happened.
If they got far, they're on foot, right in the general area.
Where is this son of a... He's here somewhere.
So now we have to lock down that neighborhood and keep track of who's going in and out, because the killer might be right next to us and us not even know it.
We brought in the SWAT team, and then they searched as far as they could in every direction. We have other deputies doing house to house, knocking on doors.
It's quite a chaotic scene in a way, of a lot of moving parts.
This is absolutely every officer with a badge and a gun that they can get their hands on. We already have 5 people killed. We could have 20 dead before this is over. We gotta make it stop. And the way to make it stop is to find him.
In a small town, word gets around very quickly. So there was a lot of news media around. The people of Fernley are terrified.
You know your neighborhoods better than we do. Be our eyes and ears. Call us.
Nobody knows what's going on. People were wondering, is he going from house to house? Why is he doing this? Who is he targeting?
A lion that is on the hunt, and they are the prey. That's pressure. An hour passes. It is the longest hour in history for that neighborhood. The urgency is incredible. They feel it in their chest. Their heart's in hammer mode at the moment.
And all of a sudden received another call of a possible burglary.
They rush over a few houses down and they talk to the homeowner. He said, I hear somebody crawling around in a crawl space under my house. He is probably able to see them from under that house, and he has a gun. That's a very awkward feeling. You begin to feel very naked indeed.
The SWAT team was called so they could do the search.
So SWAT dives under that house, and they find nothing.
But they did locate a phone and a large amount of cash.
Maybe he was here, but he's not here now. So where did he go? When you know that your shooter is nearby, your head is on a swivel, your gun is in your hand, the safety is off, you're prepared to defend yourself. And you better be, because he's prepared to kill you. So they're looking around, and all of a sudden they hear somebody yell, there he is.
And all of a sudden he comes like through the garage, and he's got a pair of jean shorts on, he's covered in blood. The SWAT team comes around the corner, sees him, and then just swarmed in on him, puts him at gunpoint, orders him onto the ground, and got him in cuffs.
You assume he has a gun on his person. But they search him, and there's no gun.
He's holding both key fobs for both the cars at Angie Duff's house.
He identifies himself as Jeremiah Bean. Okay, Jeremiah, it's time to talk to this boy and find out what his maladjustment is.
So what kind of things were these voices saying?
To kill somebody.
It's euphoric when you finally find the animal and you lock him up. And he suddenly doesn't look like he's 12 feet tall. He just looks like what he is, an idiot.
Once you get this person in custody, it's almost a relief. And now it's piecing together how this all happened.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
And are you willing to answer some questions at this time?
Yeah.
He says he wants to talk. Like, I want to tell my story.
All right, what do you need to tell us?
I don't want to say that I'm crazy, but I just wanted to plead criminally insane. I'm just, just hearing stuff. The voice will tell me to do this and do that.
Mr. Bean decides he's going to do an absolutely pathetic third-grade level impersonation of a schizophrenic. He's acting as if he's speaking to voices coming out of his own head. What he's getting is an F from his acting instructor because it's just pathetic.
So what kind of things were these voices saying?
They're just saying to kill somebody.
To kill someone? Okay.
Yeah.
They see through his smokescreen in a microsecond.
Hey, Jeremiah, take your time on this, okay?
And eventually Jeremiah realizes that his shtick isn't working, and he starts to break down.
But, I just got tired of life, and, I just ended up, doing some foul stuff.
He just literally painted the story from the first time that he sought the papes and decided that he was going to rob them to the point where he was in the holding cell.
He says he was staying with a friend in the area of the Pape's home. He's a heroin addict. He's desperate for money.
He had been watching the Papes and kind of looked at them as an easy target. That's why he chose to victimize them.
The garage door was open, and I walked in, and then I just went into the bedroom. And then I shot the lady first in the back of the head. I think she was sleeping.
Her husband rushed to her aid and suffered the same fate.
He came back into the bedroom, and then I shot the old man in the front of the head.
Then he ransacked their home, took their property of value, and stayed there for a day or two.
Then what happened?
I took the truck, and then I took off.
He went to Reno and pawned some things, got some money, went to a strip club.
He was using the Papes as his own personal ATM.
And then he came back to Fernley, right back to the Papes' house.
They were smelling pretty bad, so I just kind of like covered them with clothes or whatever.
Okay. Were they in the same spots or what?
They were in the closet.
How did they get there?
Oh, I put them there.
And he said that he then took bottles of shampoo and squeezed them onto the carpet, hoping that that would mask the scent.
And then Sunday came around, I was just like, I'm gonna take the truck again and, I'm gonna just try to have some fun or whatever. I left out to go to Reno.
He drives it onto I-80 and heads west.
Okay, so what happened?
So I was trying to make a U-turn off of the freeway, out in Sparks. The truck got stuck in a ditch.
He's within a quarter mile of the gas station where Graham works. Graham sees him off the road in this truck.
Okay, so how did you get him to stop?
I just waited. I was like, hey, excuse me. And then I just went blank. Then I shot him.
Was he still inside the car? Was he outside?
He was still inside the car. And I tried to scoot him over or whatever, but then he kind of like just fell out.
He grabbed his pants to try to move him, and they came down. He grabbed his shirt to drag him, and all it did was pull up. That's why he's almost naked. So now he jumps in Graham's truck.
But instead of getting back on I-80 heading westbound, for some reason, he went back to Fernley, right back to the Pape's house.
Then he realizes he's got another thing he has to cover up.
And then I set the truck on fire. I poured a gas can all over the truck. The matches were actually in the guy's truck. And then I ran.
He decided he was going to hide all of his crimes by starting a fire and then hopefully escape and disappear, which didn't go exactly as he planned.
I was just like, I don't know what to do. So I went a couple of houses up, and I just opened the door, and I went into the house.
The home of Angie Duff.
He said he wasn't there to rob the house. He was there to simply garner a vehicle.
And then what happened?
The lady came out of the bedroom, and she was just like, where are you? And then that's when I shot. And it missed.
Angie goes into fight or flight, but she picks fight, and so she begins to tussle with him a little bit. And he says that there's a struggle over the gun, and he gets her pushed back, and she kind of slumps, and then he drops the gun and he shoots her.
Then what happened?
Her husband came from the backyard.
Lester, who is in the backyard watching the Pape's house burn, comes back in the house. And Bean said that, basically he caught him off guard, firing at him, hitting him and missing him, blowing up the sliding glass door. They get into a small scuffle, but it wasn't much. He said Lester went down pretty fast. And then he grabbed a knife and started stabbing him.
Now he is covered in blood.
Then what happens?
I started to get undressed or whatever. And then I just left to hide.
And here come the police. Oh, no. Now he's trapped.
Thank you for telling me these things. It can't be easy.
You could see when he was done talking, his whole body just relaxed. He'd got it all off his chest.
After the confession is complete, they recovered a .22 caliber pistol, the ultimate corroborating evidence. He is toast, as we say in the murder biz.
The person of interest or suspect in 5 murder cases made his first court appearance just minutes ago.
So we're all waiting in the courtroom. He comes in with his attorney and stands up and pleads not guilty. It was really mind-boggling to everybody because he confessed right away that he did it. So he goes into trial.
The evidence going to trial is overwhelming. Jeremiah Bean is convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. They say the death penalty is revenge. They're right. It is. Time for you to say goodnight, Jeremiah.
Death is permanent, and he didn't care. He killed 5 innocent people that he didn't even know. People that had families, people that had kids and grandkids, and didn't think twice about it.
What I learned from this case is keep an open mind because anything can happen. And as much as I like to look at the good in people, there are wolves among us that will do terrible things.
The last time I was out here to tend to Ellie's cross was about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago. It just is a reminder that he's not forgotten.
On the afternoon of July 8, 1965, 52 people climbed aboard a Canadian Pacific Airlines Douglas DC-6B believing they understood exactly how their day would end. Some expected to be welcomed by family members waiting hundreds of miles away. Some imagined another ordinary business trip. A few carried gifts tucked carefully inside their luggage, wrapped with the quiet excitement of seeing someone they had not embraced for months. The 6 members of the flight crew had done what they had done countless times before. Checklists were completed. Instruments were verified. Weather reports were reviewed. Doors were secured. Every familiar routine whispered the same comforting promise. This would be another uneventful flight across the vast Canadian wilderness. No one standing on the tarmac could have imagined that, less than an hour later, the airplane would no longer exist as a complete aircraft. There would be no desperate struggle to reach a nearby airport. There would be no miraculous emergency landing. There would be no survivors left behind to explain what happened inside those final terrifying seconds. Only silence. A silence so complete that it would survive for generations. For decades, investigators, aviation experts, journalists, historians, and amateur detectives would return again and again to the same haunting question. They would examine shattered aluminum recovered from dense forests. They would study photographs until the edges curled with age. They would replay radio recordings, interview witnesses, reconstruct debris fields, analyze explosive residues, and revisit every known passenger aboard the flight. Each new theory seemed to illuminate one small corner of the mystery before disappearing into another shadow. Someone almost certainly carried a bomb onto that airplane. Someone almost certainly knew exactly what was about to happen. And that person vanished forever alongside every victim. Unlike many notorious crimes, there was never an arrest. No courtroom confession. No dramatic interrogation. No fingerprint that suddenly solved everything decades later. There was no surviving witness who could point across a room and whisper a single name. Every possible suspect died with everyone else, leaving investigators to interrogate fragments of metal instead of living people. It is a crime scene where every witness became a victim. That is what makes this case so unsettling. Not because investigators lacked determination. Not because evidence was ignored. But because the truth may have exploded into thousands of pieces before anyone even knew a crime had occurred. Imagine looking up from a quiet stretch of forest in central British Columbia during a warm summer afternoon. The wind moves gently through the pine trees. Birds disappear into the canopy. Nothing feels unusual. Then, without warning, a violent crack tears through the sky. Heads turn instinctively toward the sound. High above the trees, a silver aircraft appears to shudder against the blue horizon. For one impossible moment, something seems terribly wrong with its shape. Then part of the airplane separates. Gravity takes over. The aircraft no longer flies. It falls. People who witnessed those moments would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. Some struggled to describe what they had seen because their minds refused to accept it. Airplanes were not supposed to come apart in midair. They were not supposed to disintegrate before reaching the ground. Yet that was exactly what unfolded over the forests near 100 Mile House. By the time rescue teams reached the wreckage, there was no rescue to perform. The forest had become a graveyard. Pieces of luggage rested among broken branches. Personal belongings lay scattered across the landscape, disconnected forever from the hands that had packed them only hours earlier. Torn sections of fuselage reflected sunlight through drifting smoke. Fire had consumed what little remained intact. Nature itself seemed unwilling to disturb the terrible stillness that settled over the crash site. 52 lives had ended within moments. But the real story was only beginning. At first glance, some wondered whether the aircraft had simply suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Aviation, particularly during the middle of the 20th century, still carried risks unfamiliar to today's travelers. Engines failed. Structural weaknesses sometimes escaped inspection. Weather could transform from calm to deadly in minutes. Yet experienced investigators noticed something that refused to fit. The damage was wrong. The breakup pattern was wrong. The violence that ripped through the tail section suggested an invisible force acting from inside rather than outside. The airplane had not merely failed. It had been torn apart. As investigators sifted through the wreckage piece by painstaking piece, another unsettling realization emerged. The explosion appeared to have originated inside the aircraft's rear lavatory. Chemical traces hinted that an improvised explosive device had detonated while the airplane cruised thousands of feet above the Canadian wilderness. It was not a massive military-grade explosion. It did not need to be. The aircraft itself became the weapon once its structural integrity had been compromised. One carefully placed blast created damage that the airplane simply could not survive. Somewhere during that ordinary flight, someone either walked into that lavatory carrying death or unknowingly became its victim. That distinction would become one of the greatest unanswered questions in Canadian criminal history. Who was the intended target? Was there even a specific target at all? Did someone plan to kill another passenger for money? Was it an act of suicide disguised as an accident? Could it have been insurance fraud? Revenge? Mental illness? A failed political statement that never reached the public? Or was the bomb never supposed to destroy the aircraft in the first place? Every possibility opens another door. Every door leads into another corridor of uncertainty. Investigators eventually focused their attention on several passengers whose backgrounds raised difficult questions. One had purchased life insurance shortly before departure. Another possessed knowledge of explosives. Another had an unusual fascination with firearms and gunpowder. Yet another reportedly struggled with psychological instability while carrying a firearm during his travels. On paper, each profile seemed capable of supporting a theory. In reality, none could be proven. Every lead ended the same way. With silence. Because every person capable of answering those questions had already died. There are crimes that shock because of their brutality. There are crimes that fascinate because of the intelligence behind them. Then there are crimes that refuse to leave because they deny us the one thing every human mind desperately seeks. Closure. The human brain dislikes unfinished stories. We instinctively search for beginnings, middles, and endings. We expect villains to be identified and victims to receive justice. We expect investigations to build toward answers. This case does none of those things. Instead, it stops abruptly, like a sentence interrupted halfway through. The final chapter is missing. Perhaps it always will be. That uncertainty transforms this tragedy into something larger than a single aviation disaster. It becomes a psychological puzzle spanning generations. Every new investigator inherits the same evidence. Every documentary revisits the same photographs. Every modern forensic expert wonders whether today's technology might finally reveal what 1965 could not. Yet even modern science has limits. Technology can identify microscopic chemical residues. It can reconstruct explosions. It can compare fingerprints, DNA, fibers, and digital records. But it cannot question the dead. It cannot recover intentions burned away inside twisted metal. It cannot ask why. That single word continues to echo through this case more loudly than any explosion ever could. Why would someone destroy an aircraft carrying strangers? Why choose a remote flight crossing endless forests? Why leave behind no message, no manifesto, no claim of responsibility? Why disappear forever inside the very crime itself? Perhaps the most haunting possibility is also the simplest. The bomber may never have expected to become history. Whatever plan existed may have failed in ways no one anticipated. A device intended to function differently may have detonated too early. A calculated act may have spiraled into catastrophe within seconds. Or perhaps everything unfolded exactly as intended. No one knows. And that uncertainty forces us into an uncomfortable place where speculation collides with evidence, where theories compete against facts, and where imagination must constantly yield to the limits of what investigators could actually prove. This is not merely the story of an airplane that fell from the sky. It is the story of 52 ordinary lives interrupted without warning. It is the story of investigators chasing a ghost through burned fragments of aluminum. It is the story of families who waited at airports long after hope had already vanished beyond the horizon. Most of all, it is the story of a mystery that has refused to surrender its secrets for more than half a century. Some crimes fade because they are solved. Others endure because they never are. This is one of them. The summer of 1965 carried a quiet confidence across much of Canada. It was an era that seemed to stand comfortably between the hardships of the Second World War and the uncertainty that would define the decades to come. Cities were growing, highways stretched farther into the wilderness, and commercial aviation had become more than a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Flying was steadily transforming into an ordinary part of life. Every successful flight reinforced a belief shared by millions of travelers. Airplanes represented progress, speed, and reliability. For many families, boarding an aircraft no longer felt like stepping into danger. It felt like stepping into the future. Canadian Pacific Airlines had earned a reputation as one of the country's premier airlines. Its red and white aircraft connected distant communities separated by mountains, forests, frozen rivers, and thousands of miles of rugged terrain. In a country as immense as Canada, flying was not simply convenient. In many cases, it was the fastest, and sometimes the only practical, way to travel between isolated regions. Routes linking Vancouver with northern communities served miners, government officials, business travelers, military personnel, vacationers, and families eager to reunite after months apart. The Douglas DC-6B assigned to Flight 21 was already a familiar sight in Canadian skies. Introduced during the golden age of piston-engine airliners, the aircraft represented dependable engineering and years of successful commercial service. Long before sleek jetliners dominated airports, airplanes like the DC-6B carried passengers across continents with remarkable consistency. Its four powerful radial engines produced a deep mechanical rhythm that experienced travelers often associated with reassurance rather than anxiety. Many passengers actually preferred aircraft they recognized, believing familiarity itself was a form of safety. On the morning of July 8, the aircraft waited quietly on the ramp at Vancouver International Airport. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency around the airplane. Fuel trucks completed their work. Cargo handlers loaded baggage into the lower compartments. Maintenance personnel performed routine inspections that had become second nature through years of repetition. Every signature on every checklist represented another small promise that the aircraft was ready to fly. Nothing in those procedures suggested that disaster was waiting inside the cabin. The airport itself reflected the atmosphere of the mid-1960s. Security was almost unrecognizable compared to modern standards. There were no sophisticated explosive detection systems. No full-body scanners. No reinforced cockpit doors. Family members could often accompany loved ones much closer to the departure gates than would ever be possible today. Air travel still retained something of the elegance associated with earlier decades. Men commonly wore jackets and ties for flights. Women often dressed in skirts or tailored suits. Flight attendants greeted passengers with polished smiles, believing that hospitality was just as important as efficiency. People boarded airplanes carrying suitcases, briefcases, wrapped packages, cameras, books, and occasionally hunting equipment or firearms when regulations permitted under the practices of the era. Items that would immediately attract attention today often passed with little concern. Society simply viewed risk through a different lens. The idea that an ordinary domestic flight could become the target of a deliberate bombing seemed almost unimaginable. Beyond the airport stretched British Columbia, a province whose beauty could overwhelm anyone seeing it from the air for the first time. Towering mountain ranges gave way to endless forests that rolled toward distant horizons. Rivers carved silver paths through valleys where small towns appeared like tiny islands surrounded by an ocean of green. Lakes reflected the afternoon sun with such clarity that they sometimes seemed indistinguishable from the sky itself. It was breathtaking country. It was also unforgiving country. Large portions of the province remained sparsely populated. Vast wilderness separated communities by hundreds of miles. Dense forests concealed cliffs, ravines, marshes, and steep hillsides that could challenge even experienced search and rescue teams. Should an aircraft ever come down in those remote regions, reaching the crash site could become an operation measured not in minutes but in hours, sometimes longer. No one boarding Flight 21 spent much time thinking about that reality. For the passengers, the journey was simply another date marked on a calendar. Some had likely arrived at the airport earlier than necessary, preferring the comfort of waiting over the anxiety of rushing through traffic. Others probably hurried through the terminal with boarding passes folded inside pockets, apologizing for running late while reassuring themselves they had arrived just in time. Conversations drifted through the departure lounge. Newspapers rustled beneath busy hands. Children glanced through wide terminal windows, pointing excitedly toward airplanes taxiing across the airfield. The future still appeared wonderfully predictable. A businessman may have reviewed contracts one final time before departure, believing the most important decisions of his day would happen inside a meeting room hundreds of miles away. A young traveler may have imagined the reunion waiting at the destination airport. Someone else could have been quietly counting the hours until seeing parents, siblings, or close friends after months apart. The flight crew likely exchanged routine conversations about weather conditions, fuel calculations, and scheduled stops, discussing the journey with the calm professionalism born from countless previous flights. These ordinary moments rarely survive history. Major tragedies have a cruel habit of reducing human lives into statistics. 52 fatalities. 1 destroyed aircraft. 1 unsolved bombing. Yet behind every number stood a person whose morning began with expectations no different from anyone else's. Someone drank coffee before leaving home. Someone kissed a spouse goodbye without realizing it would become their final farewell. Someone promised to telephone after landing. Someone packed carefully folded clothes, believing they would unpack them later that evening. History remembers the disaster. Families remembered the people. Meanwhile, beyond the airport, the weather offered little reason for concern. Conditions along much of the planned route were considered suitable for flight. Experienced crews had flown similar paths through British Columbia countless times. Seasonal changes, mountain winds, and changing cloud layers always demanded respect, but nothing suggested that nature itself posed an unusual threat that afternoon. Ironically, the greatest danger aboard Flight 21 did not come from the sky outside. If investigators would later prove correct, it had already been carried onto the aircraft before departure. At that moment, however, no one possessed the slightest reason to suspect such a possibility. The atmosphere inside the cabin was almost certainly quiet once boarding concluded. Overhead compartments closed with familiar clicks. Seat belts fastened. Engines gradually increased in power as the aircraft prepared to taxi. Flight attendants completed final cabin checks, smiling politely as they answered last-minute questions from passengers. Some people gazed through oval windows while others buried themselves in magazines or newspapers before the airplane even began moving. For frequent travelers, the sequence became almost hypnotically familiar. Taxi. Pause. Engine power increasing. The subtle vibration spreading through the cabin. The steady acceleration. The moment wheels separated from the runway. The gentle sensation of climbing into open sky. Every successful takeoff reinforced the invisible bond of trust between passengers and the professionals guiding them. Once airborne, most surrendered control completely. They trusted pilots they had never met, mechanics whose names they would never know, engineers who designed the aircraft decades earlier, and systems operating far beyond their understanding. Trust is the foundation of commercial aviation. On July 8, 1965, that trust would be shattered in a way few Canadians had ever imagined possible. As Flight 21 climbed away from Vancouver, the city slowly receded beneath the aircraft. Roads became narrow threads weaving through neighborhoods. Buildings shrank into neat geometric patterns. Ships rested in coastal waters like tiny toys floating on polished glass. Soon, the urban landscape surrendered to forests, mountains, and lakes stretching endlessly toward the north. Inside the cockpit, instruments indicated another routine climb. Airspeed stabilized. Navigation checkpoints approached one after another. Radio communications continued according to procedure. Every indication suggested the aircraft was performing exactly as expected. Elsewhere inside the cabin, ordinary life unfolded in dozens of separate stories occurring simultaneously. Someone may have closed tired eyes hoping to sleep through part of the journey. Someone else may have stared out the window, captivated by snow lingering on distant mountain peaks despite the warmth of July below. A couple perhaps exchanged quiet conversation impossible for anyone beyond the next row to hear. A child may have pressed a forehead against cool glass, mesmerized by clouds drifting beneath the airplane. These imagined moments are not preserved in official investigation files, yet they remind us of something essential. Before becoming victims of one of Canada's greatest unsolved crimes, these people were simply travelers moving through an otherwise ordinary afternoon. No alarm had sounded. No confrontation had erupted inside the cabin. No emergency announcement warned passengers that danger was unfolding only a few feet away. Whatever events ultimately led to the explosion remained hidden beneath the surface of normality. And perhaps that is what makes the story so profoundly unsettling. Catastrophes often announce themselves. Storm clouds gather. Engines fail. Smoke appears. People recognize that something has gone wrong. This tragedy offered no such warning. For nearly an hour, Flight 21 traveled across one of the most beautiful landscapes in North America while carrying a secret capable of ending every life on board. Neither the passengers nor the crew could see it. Neither could anyone watching the aircraft pass peacefully overhead. The stage had been set long before the first distress call would echo through the radio. By the time anyone realized that something extraordinary was happening inside the aircraft, events had already moved beyond the point where human intervention could change the outcome. The ordinary afternoon that began with confidence, routine, and quiet expectation was steadily approaching the moment when it would become one of the darkest chapters in Canadian aviation history. One of the greatest challenges in telling the story of Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 21 is that there was never a single victim. There was no individual whose life could represent the entire tragedy. There was no lone family whose grief defined the loss. Instead, there were 52 separate lives, each moving along a different path, each carrying a different dream, and each ending at precisely the same moment above the forests of British Columbia. History often compresses disasters into numbers because numbers are easier to remember than names. 52 fatalities. 46 passengers. 6 crew members. Yet numbers cannot laugh. They cannot worry. They cannot make promises over breakfast or write letters before leaving home. They cannot feel excitement about a new job waiting in another city or the comfort of believing someone will be waiting at the airport after landing. Every person aboard Flight 21 had a story that began long before they stepped onto the airplane. Some were professionals whose work regularly carried them across Canada's enormous landscape. Business travelers in the mid-1960s often spent long hours moving between remote communities where mining operations, construction projects, government offices, and transportation networks depended on face-to-face meetings. For them, flights like this one were simply another appointment on an already crowded schedule. They packed briefcases instead of vacation bags. Their thoughts were likely occupied by contracts, reports, deadlines, or conversations that had not yet taken place. Others traveled for reasons that had nothing to do with work. A family reunion. A holiday. A long-awaited visit. A chance to finally see someone whose face had become familiar only through letters and telephone calls. Canada's geography has always stretched families across remarkable distances. Parents watched children build lives in provinces hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Brothers and sisters often found employment in different regions, separated by mountains and forests that made travel difficult. Airplanes shortened those distances, transforming journeys that once required days into flights lasting only hours. Every ticket represented more than transportation. It represented connection. Some passengers may have counted the hours until they embraced loved ones waiting at the next destination. Those embraces would never happen. Among the 52 people were 6 crew members whose responsibilities extended far beyond simply operating an aircraft. Pilots carried the enormous responsibility of navigating passengers safely across immense wilderness. Every decision inside the cockpit reflected years of training, discipline, and experience. They understood weather patterns, aircraft systems, navigation procedures, emergency checklists, and the countless small details invisible to passengers sitting quietly behind the cockpit door. To those on board, the crew represented certainty. Even when passengers felt nervous during turbulence or uneasy about flying, the calm professionalism of experienced pilots often restored confidence. A reassuring announcement over the cabin speaker could reduce anxiety more effectively than any technical explanation. The flight attendants played a different but equally important role. They welcomed passengers aboard with practiced warmth, answered questions, assisted elderly travelers, comforted children, served refreshments, and quietly monitored the cabin throughout the journey. In the public imagination of the 1960s, they symbolized elegance and hospitality. Behind that polished appearance, however, stood professionals trained to respond to emergencies that most travelers hoped they would never witness. On July 8, they had no reason to expect that they would soon face an emergency unlike anything aviation training manuals could adequately prepare them for. The passengers themselves came from different walks of life, yet they shared one simple belief that afternoon. They believed they would arrive. That assumption shaped every ordinary decision made before departure. Someone packed only enough clothing for a short stay because they expected to return home a few days later. Someone left unfinished work on a desk, intending to complete it after coming back. Someone promised a child they would bring home a souvenir. Someone reminded a spouse not to worry because the flight would be routine. These ordinary promises gain heartbreaking significance only in hindsight. No one wakes in the morning believing that everyday rituals are becoming final memories. Across Canada, family members continued with their own routines after saying goodbye at the airport. Parents returned to work. Husbands drove back toward offices. Wives prepared evening meals. Children attended summer activities without realizing that the adults they expected to see again would never walk through the front door. At destination airports, arrival times were probably noted with quiet anticipation rather than urgency. Someone glanced at a wristwatch. Someone checked the arrivals board. Someone searched each taxi entering the terminal area. Perhaps flowers rested on a nearby seat. Perhaps a child rehearsed exactly what they planned to say after spotting a familiar face emerging from the gate. Those moments belong to every aviation tragedy. There is always another story unfolding simultaneously beyond the aircraft itself. The story of waiting. Waiting begins with optimism. It slowly transforms into confusion. Then concern. Then fear. Finally, unbearable certainty. None of those families knew that their journey through grief had already begun while they continued believing the airplane remained safely in the sky. The tragedy also reminds us how easily ordinary strangers become forever connected by circumstance. Before boarding, most passengers probably knew very little about one another. They may have exchanged polite smiles while waiting in line. Perhaps they briefly competed for overhead luggage space or apologized after accidentally brushing shoulders in the aisle. They occupied neighboring seats without imagining that history would permanently bind their names together. They boarded as strangers. They became victims together. Decades later, researchers would attempt to reconstruct passenger lists, occupations, travel purposes, and personal histories. Some records survived. Others remained incomplete. Time slowly eroded details that once seemed insignificant. Newspapers naturally focused attention on the scale of the disaster rather than preserving every individual biography. Families mourned privately while investigators concentrated on determining why the aircraft had fallen. The result is an unusual silence surrounding many of the victims. We know how they died. For many, we know remarkably little about how they lived. That absence itself becomes part of the tragedy. Every unsolved crime risks allowing the mystery to overshadow the humanity of those caught within it. Discussions gradually shift toward suspects, forensic evidence, and investigative theories. Victims become supporting characters in the story of the crime committed against them. Flight 21 deserves to be remembered differently. Before there was an investigation, there were people. Before there were theories about bombs and suspects, there were ordinary conversations inside an airport terminal. Before investigators searched forests for wreckage, families expected telephone calls announcing safe arrivals. The victims never chose to become part of Canadian history. History chose them. Among those aboard may have been people who disliked flying but accepted it as necessary. Others may have loved every minute spent above the clouds, finding peace in watching mountain ranges disappear beneath the wings. Human beings experience the same journey in remarkably different ways. One passenger might spend an entire flight reading a novel. Another studies maps through the window. Someone else closes their eyes almost immediately after takeoff. Another strikes up conversation with the stranger sitting beside them. Those countless private moments vanished without leaving records. Yet imagining them reminds us that life continued normally inside the cabin until the final minutes. There was almost certainly laughter somewhere among the rows of seats. Someone probably smiled at a joke. Someone adjusted a child's blanket. Someone accepted a cup of coffee. Someone looked outside and admired the endless forests below, never realizing those same forests would soon become the final resting place for everyone aboard. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the victim's story is its complete absence of warning. Many crimes provide at least a fleeting opportunity to recognize danger. Victims notice suspicious behavior, receive threats, or sense that something feels wrong. Flight 21 offered no such chance. If investigators were correct that an explosive device had been hidden inside the aircraft, then nearly everyone aboard remained completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Ignorance became its own fragile form of peace. For nearly an hour, ordinary life continued uninterrupted. Passengers settled comfortably into their seats. Crew members carried out familiar duties. Pilots monitored instruments with quiet confidence. No one knew that time itself had become limited. The aircraft continued northward over landscapes that had existed for thousands of years before human flight became possible. Rivers wound through valleys untouched by cities. Endless forests stretched toward distant mountains whose snow-covered peaks gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. From above, the wilderness appeared peaceful beyond description. It offered no hint of the violence about to unfold. Long after the wreckage had been recovered and the investigation had officially begun, loved ones would struggle with questions that could never receive satisfying answers. What were their final conversations? Did they know what was happening? Did they suffer? Did anyone have time to understand? These are questions that accompany almost every aviation disaster because they arise from love rather than curiosity. Families search desperately for details not because information changes the outcome, but because imagination often creates fears even greater than reality. In the case of Flight 21, investigators would eventually reconstruct enough physical evidence to understand much of what happened to the aircraft. They could not reconstruct every human moment inside the cabin. Those final minutes remain largely unwitnessed. The voices that could have told the story disappeared forever with the airplane itself. And so the victims remain suspended in history exactly as they boarded that summer afternoon, ordinary people carrying ordinary hopes, unaware that they were living through the final chapter of lives that deserved far more time than fate allowed. Their stories deserve to be remembered not because of the mystery that followed, but because behind every twisted fragment of aluminum recovered from the forests of British Columbia was a life interrupted, a family forever changed, and a future that would never arrive. At 2:42 in the afternoon, Flight 21 lifted smoothly from Vancouver International Airport and began its scheduled journey north. The takeoff was uneventful, the kind of departure that passengers quickly forgot as the excitement of leaving the ground gave way to the quiet rhythm of cruise flight. The Douglas DC-6B climbed steadily through the summer sky, its 4-piston engines working in perfect harmony. From inside the cabin, the vibration was familiar rather than alarming. Outside the windows, the city slowly dissolved into a patchwork of neighborhoods, highways, rivers, and forests before disappearing beneath layers of distance. Within minutes, life aboard the aircraft settled into an ordinary routine. Seat belts were loosened. Passengers adjusted themselves more comfortably. Some opened newspapers folded neatly beneath their arms before boarding. Others gazed silently through oval windows, watching mountain peaks emerge from beneath scattered clouds. Flight attendants moved calmly through the aisle, carrying out duties they had performed hundreds of times before. There was nothing hurried in their movements. Nothing suggested concern. The cabin reflected the peaceful predictability that commercial aviation promised in the middle of the 20th century. Behind the cockpit door, the flight crew monitored instruments that confirmed everything was progressing exactly according to plan. Altitude increased steadily. Engine temperatures remained within expected limits. Navigation checkpoints approached one after another. Radio communication with air traffic control remained routine. The airplane climbed toward approximately 16,000 feet, cruising above one of the most breathtaking landscapes in North America. Below, British Columbia stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. Dense evergreen forests covered rolling hills like an enormous green blanket. Rivers wound through valleys carved by thousands of years of geological change. Lakes shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight, reflecting the sky with almost mirror-like perfection. Small communities appeared only occasionally, separated by vast distances of untouched wilderness. From that altitude, the landscape seemed peaceful beyond imagination. It was impossible to know that somewhere inside the aircraft another story was unfolding. The official investigation would later conclude that the explosion originated inside the rear left lavatory. Exactly who entered that small compartment during the flight remains unknown. No surviving witnesses could reconstruct the sequence of movements inside the cabin. There were no security cameras. No passenger interviews. No final testimony. Every answer investigators eventually reached came not from eyewitnesses, but from damaged metal, chemical residue, and painstaking forensic reconstruction. At some point during the flight, an explosive device detonated. Whether it had been timed, triggered intentionally, or activated accidentally has never been established. The person responsible died before explaining any motive. The exact second before the blast has become one of the great unknowable moments in Canadian criminal history. Perhaps the cabin remained completely quiet. Perhaps passengers continued reading without looking up. Perhaps a flight attendant was preparing refreshments only a few rows away. Whatever the reality, it lasted only an instant. Then everything changed. The explosion itself was relatively small compared to the destructive power people often imagine when they hear the word bomb. It did not need to be enormous. Commercial aircraft depend upon carefully balanced structural integrity. Even localized damage in a critical area can begin a catastrophic chain reaction. The blast ripped through the rear section of the fuselage. Metal fractured violently. Pressure escaped with explosive force. Critical structural members near the tail section suffered devastating damage. Within moments, the aircraft was no longer structurally capable of remaining intact. The crew recognized the emergency almost immediately. Somewhere inside the cockpit, alarms may have sounded. Instruments likely began behaving in ways no experienced pilot ever wanted to witness. Control responses changed dramatically as the damaged tail struggled to perform its essential function. Pilots train repeatedly for emergencies, but no amount of preparation can fully compensate for an aircraft literally coming apart in flight. Air traffic controllers suddenly heard a transmission that shattered the routine calm of the afternoon. Mayday! 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 3 desperate distress calls echoed across the radio. The words themselves were brief. Their meaning was unmistakable. Something catastrophic had happened. Controllers attempted to establish communication, but events inside the aircraft were unfolding far faster than anyone on the ground could possibly react. There was no opportunity to coordinate an emergency landing. No nearby runway could be reached in time. Every passing second carried the aircraft farther beyond recovery. Meanwhile, people on the ground began witnessing something they would never forget. Residents living near the forests around 100 Mile House described hearing an unusual sound from above. Some recalled what resembled a loud explosion echoing across the afternoon sky. Others instinctively looked upward after hearing the sharp report, expecting perhaps a military aircraft or some distant thunder despite the fair weather. Instead, they saw an airplane in terrible distress. Witnesses later described seeing portions of the aircraft separating in midair. The tail section appeared to break away from the fuselage. The graceful silhouette of a functioning airliner transformed into something almost impossible to comprehend. Airplanes are designed to fly. This one appeared to be falling apart while still thousands of feet above the earth. Inside the cabin, those final moments can only be imagined through the physical evidence left behind. The violent decompression, structural breakup, and loss of control would have unfolded with terrifying speed. Passengers who had spent the previous hour believing they were on an ordinary flight suddenly found themselves inside an unfolding catastrophe beyond human control. The aircraft entered a fatal descent. Without its full tail assembly functioning properly, maintaining controlled flight became virtually impossible. Pilots almost certainly fought desperately to retain whatever authority remained over the aircraft. Every instinct developed through years of experience would have driven them to stabilize the airplane, reduce the descent, and search for any possibility of survival. But the damage was overwhelming. Physics offered no mercy. Gravity completed what the explosion had begun. The Douglas DC-6B descended rapidly toward the forests below, shedding debris as it fell. Pieces of the aircraft scattered across a wide area before the main wreckage struck the ground with tremendous force. The impact unleashed another violent release of energy as fuel ignited, producing fires that quickly consumed large portions of the wreckage. The quiet wilderness erupted into chaos. Smoke rose above the trees. Fragments of aluminum became tangled among broken branches. Personal belongings were thrown across the forest floor. The journey that had begun so routinely in Vancouver ended in one of the most remote locations imaginable. There were no survivors. The speed with which the disaster unfolded remains one of its most haunting aspects. Less than an hour separated an ordinary takeoff from complete destruction. Families who had waved goodbye at the airport were still going about their afternoon routines, completely unaware that the people they loved were already gone. At airports farther along the route, no one yet understood why Flight 21 would never arrive. Employees may initially have assumed a minor delay. Weather. Air traffic congestion. Routine operational issues. Commercial flights occasionally arrived behind schedule. Few people immediately imagined catastrophe. Only gradually did concern begin replacing patience. Meanwhile, emergency services in British Columbia struggled to determine exactly where the aircraft had come down. The province's immense forests complicated every aspect of the search. Initial reports from witnesses varied depending upon where they had observed the aircraft. Distances in the wilderness often proved deceptive. Smoke visible from one location could appear much farther away than it actually was. Search aircraft began scanning enormous stretches of terrain. Ground teams prepared to enter remote areas where roads were limited and dense forests restricted visibility. Even after the wreckage was located, reaching it would require determination, coordination, and endurance. For those first responders, hope remained an obligation despite the overwhelming evidence confronting them. Every aviation disaster begins as a rescue mission. Only later does it become a recovery operation. As teams approached the crash site, the scale of destruction became painfully clear. The aircraft had not landed. It had disintegrated. Fire continued consuming portions of the wreckage. The surrounding forest bore fresh scars where debris had torn through trees before striking the ground. Smoke lingered in the still summer air, carrying with it the unmistakable evidence that no one could possibly have survived such violence. The realization settled slowly but completely. 52 people had died. An ordinary afternoon had transformed into one of the darkest moments in Canadian aviation history. Yet amid the devastation, another realization was beginning to emerge, one that would alter the direction of the investigation entirely. Experienced investigators knew that airplanes rarely lose their tail sections without an underlying cause. Mechanical failures leave signatures. Weather leaves signatures. Mid-air collisions leave signatures. Explosions leave signatures as well. Somewhere within the scattered wreckage lay the evidence explaining why a perfectly serviceable aircraft had suddenly ceased to exist. The forest had become more than a crash site. It had become a crime scene. No one standing among the twisted metal that evening could yet identify the person responsible. No one knew whether the disaster resulted from sabotage, accident, or some entirely unforeseen event. They knew only that something extraordinary had happened high above the forests, and that every answer would have to be reconstructed from thousands of shattered fragments spread across miles of wilderness. The victims could no longer speak. The aircraft itself would have to tell the story. And every broken piece of aluminum, every damaged rivet, every burned section of fuselage, and every tiny fragment recovered from the forest floor would soon become a silent witness in one of Canada's most enduring unsolved criminal investigations. By the time the first search teams reached the crash site, hope had already surrendered to reality. The journey into the forests near 100 Mile House was slow and difficult. Thick stands of pine and fir surrounded the area where the aircraft had fallen, while uneven terrain forced rescuers to move carefully through undergrowth littered with broken branches and freshly scattered debris. Even before they reached the main wreckage, there were unmistakable signs that this had not been a controlled landing. Fragments of aluminum hung from treetops. Pieces of insulation drifted among shattered limbs. Personal belongings lay scattered across the forest floor, separated forever from the people who had packed them only hours earlier. The silence carried an unusual weight. In many aviation disasters, rescue workers are driven by the possibility that someone may still be alive. Every passing minute matters. Voices are called into the wreckage. Medical teams prepare for survivors suffering burns, fractures, or shock. That urgency gives purpose to every movement. Here, the silence answered every question before anyone spoke. There were no cries for help. No movement beneath the twisted metal. No miracle waiting to be discovered. The impact and the fire had left no chance for survival. As the smoke slowly thinned, the true scale of the destruction became visible. The Douglas DC-6B had not remained intact after striking the ground. Entire sections of the aircraft had broken apart during the descent and upon impact, scattering wreckage across a wide area of wilderness. The debris field itself immediately attracted the attention of experienced investigators. Airplanes that simply lose power or suffer routine mechanical failures often leave different patterns than aircraft that experience catastrophic structural failure in midair. Even before laboratory testing began, the forest was already revealing clues. Investigators from aviation authorities and members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly understood that preserving the scene would be essential. Every fragment mattered. A bent section of fuselage might reveal the direction of explosive force. A damaged rivet could indicate whether metal failed because of impact or because enormous pressure tore it apart while still airborne. Even the location of scattered debris could help reconstruct the aircraft's final moments. The crash site became more than a place of mourning. It became an enormous outdoor laboratory. Searchers marked the positions of major pieces before moving them. Photographs documented every section exactly as it had been found. Measurements were taken repeatedly. Maps slowly filled with symbols representing pieces of wings, sections of fuselage, luggage, engines, and countless smaller fragments whose importance was not yet understood. Every item recovered entered a growing puzzle. Unlike ordinary criminal investigations conducted inside homes or city streets, this crime scene stretched across rugged wilderness. Nature itself had become an obstacle. Trees hid debris beneath dense branches. Small pieces disappeared into thick vegetation. Wildlife and changing weather threatened to disturb fragile evidence before every fragment could be documented. The investigators faced an uncomfortable reality. If they overlooked even one critical piece, the truth might disappear forever. Recovery teams worked methodically despite the emotional burden surrounding them. Personal belongings found among the wreckage served as painful reminders that every piece of evidence once belonged to a living person. A suitcase partially burned by fire. A wristwatch stopped forever at the moment of destruction. Torn clothing caught beneath broken branches. Everyday objects suddenly transformed into silent witnesses. Each discovery carried two meanings. One belonged to grieving families. The other belonged to investigators searching for answers. The initial assumption considered by many outside the investigation was that the aircraft may have suffered some catastrophic mechanical malfunction. Mechanical failures had occurred throughout aviation history, and no responsible investigator was willing to dismiss that possibility without evidence. Every engine would need careful examination. Flight control systems required detailed reconstruction. Maintenance records demanded thorough review. Yet certain observations began challenging that explanation almost immediately. Several recovered sections of the fuselage displayed deformation that suggested force originating from inside the aircraft rather than outside it. Instead of being crushed inward by impact alone, portions of the metal appeared bent outward. That distinction may seem subtle to an ordinary observer, but to specialists investigating aircraft accidents, it represented one of the most important clues imaginable. Metal tells stories. When subjected to enormous forces, it bends according to the direction of pressure. Those patterns cannot lie. Investigators painstakingly examined torn edges of aluminum skin, searching for evidence that could distinguish explosion from structural fatigue. Fatigue cracks usually leave recognizable characteristics after years of repeated stress. Explosive forces produce something entirely different: violent tearing, distortion, and damage radiating outward from a single point. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Attention shifted toward the rear left section of the aircraft. More specifically, toward the rear lavatory. It was here that investigators believed the chain of destruction had begun. The conclusion did not emerge overnight. It resulted from countless hours spent recovering fragments, matching broken pieces together, studying burn patterns, and comparing damage throughout the aircraft. Like assembling an enormous three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, specialists reconstructed portions of the airplane inside hangars, attempting to understand how the aircraft had looked immediately before the explosion. The closer they looked, the more difficult it became to support the theory of accidental mechanical failure. Then came the chemical evidence. Laboratory analysis identified residues consistent with compounds associated with a low-powered explosive device. Investigators detected traces including potassium nitrate, carbon, and acidic residues that strongly suggested the presence of an improvised explosive mixture rather than ordinary aircraft materials. Although the explosion itself was relatively small compared with military explosives, it had occurred in precisely the wrong location. Aircraft structures depend on strength distributed across carefully engineered components. Damage near the tail section can have catastrophic consequences because that portion of the airplane stabilizes flight. Destroy enough of that structure, and even perfectly functioning engines become irrelevant. The aircraft simply cannot continue flying. This realization transformed the investigation overnight. The focus shifted from accident to crime. No longer were investigators merely asking what failed. They were asking who caused it. That change altered every aspect of the case. Police officers joined aviation specialists in examining passenger backgrounds. Detectives requested travel records, employment histories, financial information, and witness statements from everyone who had interacted with passengers before departure. Families who expected condolences now found themselves answering questions about loved ones' occupations, relationships, recent behavior, and reasons for traveling. These interviews required extraordinary sensitivity. Every grieving relative had just suffered unimaginable loss. Yet investigators needed to determine whether someone aboard had intentionally carried an explosive device onto the aircraft. It was a painful balance between compassion and necessity. Meanwhile, specialists continued reconstructing the physical evidence. The debris field revealed that portions of the aircraft had separated before impact, confirming eyewitness accounts from people on the ground who described seeing the tail section break away while the airplane remained in the air. This detail became critically important because it eliminated several alternative explanations. The aircraft had not simply struck the ground and broken apart. It had already begun disintegrating thousands of feet above the forests. That single fact reshaped the entire timeline. The emergency began before the crash. The crash itself became the final consequence rather than the initial event. Investigators also examined maintenance histories with remarkable care. Every inspection completed before departure came under scrutiny. Mechanics were interviewed. Maintenance logs were reviewed line by line. If any overlooked defect existed, investigators intended to find it. They found no evidence that the aircraft had suffered a pre-existing mechanical problem capable of producing the observed destruction. That absence strengthened the bombing hypothesis even further. Yet proving that an explosion occurred represented only half the battle. Finding the person responsible would prove far more difficult. Unlike crimes committed on the ground, every potential witness aboard Flight 21 had died. Every conversation that occurred inside the cabin vanished forever. Investigators could not ask passengers whether they noticed suspicious behavior. They could not interview flight attendants about unusual luggage or strange interactions. The cockpit crew could no longer describe the emergency unfolding behind them. The aircraft itself remained the only surviving witness. Its testimony consisted entirely of broken metal. As investigators reconstructed the final minutes, they also began considering practical questions surrounding the bomb itself. How had it been brought aboard? Was it hidden inside baggage? Carried by hand? Left unattended before boarding? Had the bomber intended to survive, or was suicide part of the plan from the beginning? Each question produced several possible answers. None produced certainty. The limitations of forensic science in 1965 also complicated the investigation. Modern investigators benefit from technologies capable of detecting microscopic traces of DNA, sophisticated chemical signatures, advanced imaging, and computerized reconstruction techniques unimaginable during the mid-1960s. The investigators working this case possessed exceptional determination but far fewer scientific tools. Every conclusion required patience. Every hypothesis demanded careful testing. Every mistake risked sending the investigation down another dead end. Despite these obstacles, the evidence consistently pointed in the same direction. A low-powered explosive device had likely detonated inside the rear left lavatory, breaching the fuselage and fatally weakening the aircraft structure. The resulting damage caused the tail section to separate in flight, leaving the crew with virtually no possibility of saving the airplane. It was an elegant conclusion from an engineering perspective. It was deeply disturbing from a human one. Because if the investigators were correct, then someone had deliberately introduced that explosive device onto a commercial flight carrying dozens of innocent people. Someone had transformed an ordinary summer afternoon into one of Canada's greatest unsolved mass murders. And somewhere among the growing stacks of recovered evidence, passenger files, laboratory reports, and reconstructed aircraft components lay the first fragile threads leading toward the identity of the person who might have done it. The investigation had uncovered the method. The motive remained hidden. The name remained unknown. The mystery was only beginning to deepen. Once investigators became convinced that Flight 21 had most likely been destroyed by an explosive device, the nature of the case changed completely. It was no longer an aviation accident in search of a technical explanation. It had become a homicide investigation involving 52 victims, one of the largest in Canadian history. Yet unlike almost every other murder case, there were no surviving witnesses to interview, no crime scene preserved behind police tape, and no suspect who could be placed under interrogation. Every person aboard the aircraft had died. If the bomber had been one of the passengers, then the killer had disappeared alongside every victim. That single fact transformed the investigation into an exercise in elimination. Detectives from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police worked alongside aviation investigators, examining every available record connected to the flight. Passenger manifests were reviewed repeatedly. Ticket purchases were traced. Employment records, financial histories, travel purposes, family relationships, military backgrounds, criminal files, and medical information all became pieces of a growing puzzle. Every passenger had to be considered. Every possibility had to be explored. The investigators faced an uncomfortable question. If someone had deliberately carried a bomb onto the aircraft, Who among the 46 passengers had both the opportunity and the possible motive? The first challenge appeared almost immediately. Opportunity was nearly impossible to measure. Commercial aviation security in 1965 bore little resemblance to what travelers know today. Passengers could board aircraft carrying luggage that received far less scrutiny than modern security procedures would allow. There were no sophisticated explosive scanners. No computerized passenger screening systems. No databases instantly flagging unusual purchases or suspicious travel histories. What seemed ordinary on the morning of July 8 might later appear significant only because investigators already knew the terrible outcome. This created an enormous risk. Hindsight can easily transform coincidence into apparent evidence. Experienced detectives understood this danger well. They knew that after a major tragedy, countless innocent actions suddenly appear suspicious. A nervous traveler may simply fear flying. A last-minute ticket purchase may reflect nothing more than changing plans. An unusual personality does not make someone a murderer. Every lead required careful verification. Among the passenger list, several individuals eventually attracted closer attention, not because investigators possessed proof against them, but because certain aspects of their backgrounds appeared consistent with possible theories surrounding the bombing. One passenger reportedly purchased life insurance shortly before boarding the flight. At first glance, this seemed alarming. If someone intended to destroy the aircraft while remaining aboard, purchasing insurance beforehand might suggest an attempt to provide financial support for surviving family members. Similar motives had appeared in other criminal investigations throughout history, making the detail impossible to ignore. Yet investigators quickly recognized another reality. During that era, purchasing flight insurance at airports was remarkably common. Automatic insurance vending machines stood inside many terminals, allowing travelers to buy policies only minutes before departure. Thousands of completely innocent passengers across North America purchased identical policies every day without any criminal intent whatsoever. The question became whether this purchase represented careful planning or simply an ordinary precaution. Investigators could never answer it with certainty. Another passenger attracted attention because of previous experience handling explosives. Knowledge alone does not establish guilt. Miners, military veterans, construction workers, and numerous professionals possessed legitimate experience with explosives during the 1960s. Canada itself relied heavily upon industries where blasting operations formed part of everyday work. Nevertheless, investigators could not ignore the possibility that someone familiar with explosives might possess both the technical knowledge and confidence necessary to construct an improvised device. Background checks examined employment histories in remarkable detail. Former colleagues were interviewed. Friends were questioned. Employers attempted to recall anything unusual from the weeks preceding the flight. Nothing investigators discovered provided definitive proof. Another individual reportedly maintained a strong interest in firearms and gunpowder. Again, this detail appeared potentially significant while remaining far from conclusive. In many parts of Canada, hunting formed an ordinary part of life. Firearms ownership, particularly among people living in rural communities, was neither rare nor inherently suspicious. An enthusiasm for hunting equipment or ammunition could easily reflect recreation rather than criminal intent. Still, detectives refused to dismiss the possibility. Could familiarity with gunpowder have enabled someone to assemble a crude explosive device? Perhaps. Did that possibility amount to evidence? No. The distinction mattered enormously. Investigators also examined another passenger whose personal history reportedly included concerns about mental health. Records suggested previous psychological instability, and there were reports that this individual had traveled while carrying a firearm under circumstances that drew later scrutiny. Once again, detectives found themselves confronting a deeply uncomfortable question. Could someone experiencing severe psychological distress have intentionally destroyed the aircraft? The theory could not be ignored. Neither could it be proven. Mental illness itself does not predict violence, and investigators understood that speculation unsupported by evidence risked unfairly stigmatizing both individuals and surviving families. They needed facts. Facts remained frustratingly scarce. Every potential suspect shared one overwhelming characteristic. They were dead. There could be no interview. No search warrant executed at a residence. No confession. No opportunity to compare contradictory statements against physical evidence. Every investigative technique that normally relies upon questioning a suspect had vanished with the crash. Instead, detectives found themselves constructing psychological profiles from fragments of correspondence, employment records, medical histories, and recollections offered by grieving relatives. The process resembled archaeology more than policing. Investigators searched through the remains of people's lives hoping that hidden motives might reveal themselves. Financial records became another major focus. Did anyone face crushing debt? Was someone expecting a substantial insurance payout? Had any passenger recently experienced divorce, unemployment, legal trouble, or devastating personal loss? Detectives explored each possibility methodically. Financial desperation has motivated countless crimes throughout history. Could it have motivated this one? Again, the evidence remained inconclusive. The investigation also considered whether the bombing may have targeted a specific passenger rather than the aircraft itself. This possibility introduced an entirely different line of inquiry. If someone wished to murder one individual, placing an explosive device aboard a flight might have represented a horrifying means of accomplishing that objective. But who could have been the intended victim? Business executives? Government employees? Private individuals involved in personal disputes? No pattern emerged. Passenger backgrounds varied too widely. No obvious connection united everyone aboard. The randomness of the victim list itself became another mystery. If this was targeted murder, investigators could not identify the intended target. If it was mass murder, they could not identify a convincing motive. The absence of a claim of responsibility complicated matters further. Many acts of politically motivated violence involve public statements. Organizations seek attention. Demands are issued. Responsibility is claimed to advance ideological objectives. Nothing like that occurred here. No group announced involvement. No manifesto appeared. No anonymous letters arrived explaining the bombing. Silence surrounded the case. Investigators even explored whether the explosive device might have detonated accidentally rather than intentionally. Could someone have been transporting unstable materials without intending harm? Could chemicals packed inside luggage have ignited unexpectedly? The forensic evidence offered little support for such theories. The location of the blast and the nature of the explosive residues continued pointing toward deliberate human action. As weeks became months, detectives confronted another enemy every investigator understands all too well: time. Witness memories faded. Documents disappeared. Potential leads grew colder. Every unanswered question became increasingly difficult to resolve. The physical evidence remained fixed, but opportunities to discover new information steadily diminished. Meanwhile, public attention shifted toward newer events. Headlines that once dominated newspapers gradually disappeared from front pages. For grieving families, however, nothing had changed. They still lacked answers. They still did not know why their loved ones had died. They still waited for investigators to identify the person responsible. Those answers never came. Instead, the investigation slowly settled into a painful pattern familiar to detectives working unsolved cases. Every promising lead eventually encountered the same obstacle: insufficient evidence. The passenger who purchased insurance remained only a person who had purchased insurance. The explosives expert remained only someone with technical knowledge. The firearms enthusiast remained only someone interested in guns and gunpowder. The psychologically troubled traveler remained only a man whose personal struggles could not legally or morally substitute for proof. Suspicion surrounded them. Evidence did not. Investigators resisted the temptation to force a conclusion where facts refused to support one. It would have been easier to publicly identify the most likely suspect and close the case. Instead, they acknowledged a far more difficult truth. Probability is not certainty. A theory is not a conviction. Questions are not evidence. That restraint preserved the integrity of the investigation, even as it denied families the closure they desperately sought. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the inquiry was the realization that the truth might already be beyond recovery. If the bomber had acted alone and died in the explosion, then the motive existed only inside one mind that no longer existed. No surviving accomplice stepped forward. No hidden diary emerged explaining the plan. No forgotten witness suddenly remembered seeing someone assemble a bomb before boarding the aircraft. The answers may have been destroyed in exactly the same instant as the airplane itself. Years later, investigators would still look back upon the same collection of suspects, the same handful of unusual circumstances, and the same frustrating absence of proof. Every road they explored eventually disappeared into uncertainty. They had established with remarkable confidence how the aircraft had been destroyed. They could not establish who had destroyed it. The investigation had reached its first great dead end, and beyond that dead end waited only decades of speculation, renewed examinations, and a mystery that refused to surrender its final secret. Most true crime stories eventually reach a moment that changes everything. A forgotten witness steps forward after years of silence. A fingerprint matches a suspect already serving time for another crime. Hidden documents surface inside an old filing cabinet. Advances in forensic science uncover DNA that investigators decades earlier could never have imagined finding. These are the moments audiences have come to expect, the dramatic breakthroughs that transform uncertainty into certainty. The story of Flight 21 offers something very different. Its greatest breakthrough did not reveal the identity of the killer. Instead, it confirmed just how much investigators already knew and how painfully little they could ever prove. As the years passed, the official investigation gradually came to a sobering conclusion. The physical evidence was remarkably consistent. The reconstruction of the aircraft repeatedly pointed toward the same explanation. Specialists remained convinced that a low-powered explosive device had detonated inside the rear left lavatory. The blast compromised the aircraft structure, causing the tail section to separate in flight. Once that happened, the crew had virtually no chance of recovering the airplane. In other words, investigators solved the engineering mystery. They never solved the human one. That distinction became increasingly important as aviation technology continued advancing through the following decades. Commercial aircraft changed dramatically. Security procedures evolved. Forensic science entered an entirely new era. Investigators who looked back at the Flight 21 case wondered whether modern techniques might finally answer the questions that had survived since 1965. Boxes of evidence remained preserved. Photographs survived. Laboratory reports continued to exist. The wreckage itself had already told investigators almost everything it could. Perhaps, some believed, science had finally caught up. Throughout the following decades, experts periodically revisited the case. Improvements in metallurgy allowed engineers to better understand structural failures. Developments in explosive residue analysis offered greater confidence when interpreting microscopic chemical traces. Computer-assisted reconstruction enabled investigators to visualize aircraft breakups with remarkable precision. Each advancement strengthened one central conclusion. The explosion had almost certainly occurred before the aircraft began falling. The bombing theory became even more convincing. Yet the closer investigators came to understanding the mechanics of the crime, the farther they seemed from identifying the person responsible. Modern forensic science excels when physical evidence can be linked directly to living individuals. DNA requires comparison. Fingerprints require records. Digital evidence requires devices. Flight 21 offered none of these opportunities. Fire destroyed much of the potential evidence. The crash scattered countless fragments across remote wilderness. Most importantly, every likely suspect had died. Even if investigators had recovered additional traces from luggage or wreckage decades later, proving who actually placed the device remained an extraordinary challenge. The greatest limitation was not technology. It was time. Time erases opportunities that no scientific advancement can restore. Witnesses pass away. Memories fade. Documents disappear. Businesses close. Personal letters are discarded. Entire generations vanish. Every year separating investigators from the crime reduced the possibility that entirely new evidence would emerge. Nevertheless, the mystery refused to disappear from public consciousness. Unlike many unsolved crimes that gradually fade into obscurity, Flight 21 remained a haunting question in Canadian history. Aviation enthusiasts continued studying accident reports. Historians revisited newspaper archives. Amateur investigators proposed theories ranging from carefully reasoned to wildly speculative. Every few years, someone believed they had discovered the missing piece. None of those theories survived careful examination. Some argued that the bomber intended only to destroy one specific passenger. Others believed financial motives involving insurance offered the strongest explanation. Still others imagined political motives unsupported by any credible evidence. The absence of definitive answers created fertile ground for speculation. Yet professional investigators repeatedly returned to the same principle. Extraordinary theories require extraordinary evidence. Speculation alone cannot solve a murder. More than half a century after the disaster, renewed public attention emerged through modern investigative storytelling. Journalists and researchers revisited the surviving records, interviewing experts familiar with the case and examining whether fresh perspectives might reveal overlooked details. Among the most significant efforts was the renewed examination presented through investigative media that carefully reconstructed both the official findings and the lingering uncertainties. Listeners encountered a surprising reality. The original investigators had not failed because they overlooked obvious evidence. They had worked meticulously. The evidence simply reached its natural limit. This realization shifted the conversation surrounding the case. Rather than criticizing the investigation, many modern experts expressed admiration for how much had actually been accomplished using the scientific tools available during the mid-1960s. The reconstruction of the explosion, identification of its likely origin, and elimination of mechanical failure represented impressive investigative achievements. What remained unsolved was not the event itself. It was the identity and motive of the individual responsible. That distinction matters because it illustrates an uncomfortable truth about criminal investigations. Not every mystery can be solved. Popular culture often encourages the belief that every crime eventually yields its secrets if detectives work hard enough. Real investigations are more complicated. Evidence can be destroyed. Witnesses can die. Chance can intervene. Some crimes occur under circumstances so extraordinary that certainty becomes permanently unreachable. Flight 21 stands as one of those rare cases. Ironically, the bombing also contributed indirectly to changes that would reshape commercial aviation in the decades that followed. While security improvements resulted from numerous incidents around the world rather than this single tragedy alone, the cumulative effect of aviation crimes gradually transformed how passengers boarded aircraft. Luggage screening became more sophisticated. Airport security tightened. Procedures that once relied almost entirely upon trust evolved into systems built around prevention. Many modern travelers never consider why such precautions exist. Cases like Flight 21 help explain the answer. Every safety measure carries a history. Every regulation reflects lessons learned from earlier tragedies. For investigators revisiting the evidence decades later, perhaps the greatest breakthrough was philosophical rather than forensic. They came to understand that the mystery itself contained an important lesson. The absence of certainty does not erase the value of careful investigation. Even without identifying the bomber, investigators reconstructed the event with remarkable precision. They established probable cause. They identified the most likely location of the explosion. They excluded alternative explanations unsupported by evidence. They preserved the integrity of the case by refusing to accuse individuals without proof. In doing so, they demonstrated something fundamental about justice. Its purpose is not merely to reach conclusions. Its purpose is to reach conclusions honestly. The temptation to solve famous cases through speculation remains powerful. Audiences naturally prefer endings. Writers seek closure. Investigators crave answers. Families deserve truth. Reality does not always cooperate. There is a quiet dignity in admitting the limits of knowledge. The Flight 21 investigation ultimately embraced that difficult honesty. The official position remained consistent. An explosive device most likely destroyed the aircraft. The available evidence did not identify the person responsible beyond reasonable doubt. That conclusion frustrated generations of investigators, but it preserved something equally important: accuracy. As years became decades, the case evolved into more than an unsolved bombing. It became a reminder that history sometimes leaves unanswered questions despite humanity's greatest efforts. Every new generation of investigators inherited the same files with renewed optimism. Every generation eventually reached nearly the same destination. The physical evidence had spoken. It had simply not spoken loudly enough. Perhaps somewhere, hidden inside an attic, an old letter still exists containing information no investigator ever read. Perhaps someone once suspected the truth but died before speaking. Perhaps the bomber left behind thoughts never discovered. Or perhaps no additional evidence has ever existed at all. Those possibilities continue to linger because certainty never arrived. The breakthrough everyone hoped for ultimately became something unexpected. It was the realization that the mystery itself might be permanent. And accepting that possibility required as much courage from investigators as solving an ordinary case would have required skill. The search for answers did not end because people stopped caring. It ended because every available path had been explored. Every significant lead had been followed. Every promising theory had been tested. Beyond that point remained only silence, the same silence that settled over the forests of British Columbia on the afternoon of July 8, 1965, after the last echoes of Flight 21 disappeared from the summer sky. There was never a courtroom for the victims of Flight 21. No judge sat beneath the weight of legal proceedings. No jury listened to closing arguments. No defense attorney rose to challenge the evidence. In most criminal investigations, the courtroom becomes the stage where truth is tested, where competing narratives are forced into confrontation, and where the final version of events is officially declared. In this case, that stage never existed because there was no one left to stand trial. The absence of a suspect made prosecution impossible from the very beginning. Even as investigators grew increasingly confident that an explosive device had destroyed the aircraft, the legal system demanded something the evidence could not provide: a person to charge. Criminal justice requires more than probability. It requires attribution. It requires proof that connects an individual to a specific act beyond reasonable doubt. Without a living suspect, the law could not proceed. For families of the victims, this created a painful and unfamiliar form of grief. In most tragedies that involve criminal responsibility, there is at least the possibility of accountability. A suspect may be arrested. Charges may be filed. Trials may begin. Even when justice is delayed, it remains conceptually within reach. But in the case of Flight 21, justice had no path forward. There was no defendant to hold responsible, no testimony to challenge, and no verdict to deliver. The official findings eventually settled into a carefully worded conclusion. Investigators stated that the evidence strongly indicated an explosive device had been detonated inside the aircraft, causing catastrophic structural failure that led to the breakup of the tail section and the subsequent crash. However, they also acknowledged that no individual could be definitively identified as responsible. The case remained open in a technical sense, but functionally it had reached its limit. This duality defined the aftermath. On one hand, there was a high level of confidence about what had happened to the aircraft. On the other hand, there was absolute uncertainty about who caused it. That separation between mechanism and identity became the defining characteristic of the case. It was not a mystery of physics. It was a mystery of humanity. Over time, administrative processes began to replace investigative urgency. Reports were archived. Evidence was catalogued and stored. Case files were preserved in government records, awaiting the possibility of future review. The wreckage itself had long since been examined and re-examined. What remained was documentation, preserved in orderly folders that could not answer the emotional questions left behind. Families, however, did not experience closure through documentation. They experienced absence in its most absolute form. There were no defendants to confront, no explanations to evaluate, no confession to interpret. The absence of a trial meant there was no structured moment when truth could be formally acknowledged in public. Instead, grief existed without resolution, stretching forward without the boundary of legal finality. Some relatives likely followed the investigation closely in its early years, hoping that updates might bring clarity. Newspaper reports would have offered fragments of information, each new development suggesting that answers were approaching. But as time passed, those updates became less frequent, and eventually the case slipped from daily attention into historical record. What remained was memory, and memory does not provide answers. The justice system, for all its structure and rigor, is built around the assumption that a responsible party can be identified. When that assumption fails, the system can still document, analyze, and preserve evidence, but it cannot complete its final function. In the case of Flight 21, investigators fulfilled their role as far as evidence allowed. They reconstructed the physical sequence of destruction with remarkable precision. They eliminated mechanical failure as a primary cause. They identified a likely origin point for the explosion. They narrowed the possibilities of how the device may have been introduced onto the aircraft. Yet none of these achievements could be translated into legal accountability. In later years, experts reviewing the case often emphasized this distinction. They pointed out that the investigation itself was not unsuccessful in a technical sense. On the contrary, it achieved a level of forensic understanding that was advanced for its time. The failure, if it can be called that, lay not in investigative performance but in structural limitation. A crime without a surviving suspect cannot reach the stage of adjudication. Occasionally, renewed interest in the case would prompt fresh examination of the evidence. Advances in forensic science invited questions about whether new techniques might reveal overlooked details. Chemical residue analysis, improved metallurgical studies, and modern reconstruction software all offered theoretical possibilities for deeper insight. Yet even as technology improved, the fundamental barrier remained unchanged. Without a suspect, there was no direct link to establish culpability. In criminal justice, evidence must ultimately converge on a person. Without that convergence, even the most compelling reconstruction remains incomplete. Flight 21 represented one of the rare cases where the reconstruction could be built almost entirely, yet still end in emptiness. This absence also shaped how the case was discussed in broader public discourse. Unlike trials that produce widely recognized verdicts, this investigation never created a moment of official closure. There was no headline declaring guilt. No televised sentencing. No historical record of conviction. Instead, there was only a gradually solidifying consensus among investigators that an act of deliberate sabotage had likely occurred, combined with an equally firm acknowledgement that responsibility could not be assigned. For historians of aviation safety, the case became an example of how limited forensic capabilities once were, and how dependent investigations were on physical evidence that could be easily destroyed in catastrophic events. For criminologists, it became a study in the boundaries of inference. For families, it remained something far more personal and far less abstract, an unanswered question that time did not resolve. In legal terms, the concept of justice typically implies resolution. A wrong is identified, a responsible party is named, and consequences follow. In this case, the chain was broken at its most critical point. The wrong was understood, but the responsible party was not. Without that link, justice could not complete its cycle. This does not mean that investigators abandoned the case or ceased to care about its outcome. Rather, it reflects a more difficult truth, that even sustained effort, scientific advancement, and institutional commitment cannot always overcome the absence of evidence pointing to an individual. The law is powerful, but it is not omniscient. Over time, the Flight 21 investigation transitioned from active inquiry into historical case study. Its documents became reference material for training, its conclusions became part of aviation safety literature, and its unresolved status became a reminder of investigative limits. Within police and aviation communities, it was remembered not for courtroom drama, but for the discipline it required in accepting uncertainty. Perhaps the most striking aspect of its aftermath is how it resists emotional simplification. There is no final confrontation to dramatize, no verdict to debate, no sentence to analyze. Instead, there is only the enduring presence of unanswered questions existing alongside carefully established facts. The aircraft was destroyed by an internal explosion. The explosion was likely caused by an improvised device. The device was almost certainly introduced by someone aboard the aircraft. That person was never identified. Each statement is supported by investigation. None resolve the central absence. In the end, the courtroom never arrived because the case never reached the point where law could act upon it. What remained instead was a record of meticulous investigation standing beside an absence that could not be filled. The justice system did what it could within the boundaries of evidence, but those boundaries defined its limits as clearly as they defined its achievements. Flight 21 therefore occupies a unique place in the history of unsolved crimes. It is not remembered for a failed trial or a controversial verdict. It is remembered for the complete absence of adjudication. A crime occurred, evidence was gathered, conclusions were drawn, and yet the final step of justice was never possible. That absence continues to define the case more than any theory or reconstruction ever could. Because in the end, the greatest unanswered question is not what happened to the aircraft. It is what justice looks like when there is no one left to hold accountable. When investigators finally step back from a case like Flight 21, what remains is not a solution, but a landscape of absence. The aircraft has long since vanished from the forest where it fell. The wreckage has been studied, catalogued, and removed or archived. The official reports have been written, reviewed, and stored in government files. The scientific conclusions have been reached with as much precision as the evidence allows. And yet, despite all of that structure, something essential never resolves. 52 people died on a summer afternoon in 1965, and the reason they died remains attached to a single unanswered question. Who did it? That question has survived longer than the memory of the flight itself in public consciousness. Over time, the details of departure schedules, aircraft type, and investigative procedures have become secondary to the emotional weight of the mystery. What persists is not just the event, but the sense that something fundamental was never completed. A story began, unfolded with devastating clarity in its middle, and then ended without its final chapter. For the families, the passage of time does not behave normally. Decades move forward in the outside world, but internally the moment of loss remains fixed. There is no progression from confusion to explanation, no gradual easing into understanding. Instead, there is only repetition of the same unanswered questions, returning in different forms as years pass. What happened in those final moments? Did they suffer? Did they know? Did they have time to understand what was unfolding around them? The investigation, for all its technical achievement, could not reach into that space. It could reconstruct the mechanics of destruction but not the human experience inside it. It could identify chemical residues and structural failure patterns but not intentions, thoughts, or final decisions. That separation is where this case continues to live, suspended between certainty and silence. In aviation history, Flight 21 is often referenced not because it is unique in tragedy, but because of how complete yet incomplete its story feels. Many accidents leave behind ambiguity in both cause and outcome. This one does not. The physical sequence is largely understood. The aircraft was almost certainly destroyed by an internal explosion that compromised its structure, leading to catastrophic breakup in flight. What remains unknown is the origin of that act and the mind behind it. As time passed, newer generations of investigators revisited the case not with expectation of resolution, but with curiosity about its limits. They examined whether modern forensic tools could extract new meaning from preserved evidence. They studied whether overlooked fragments might contain new chemical signatures. They explored whether advancements in behavioral analysis could narrow psychological possibilities among known passengers. Each attempt, however, eventually circled back to the same obstacle. Without a surviving suspect, there is no anchor point to transform inference into proof. This is where the case quietly separates itself from most others. It does not invite solution. It resists completion. In popular imagination, unsolved mysteries often carry a sense of hidden resolution waiting to be discovered. A final clue, a forgotten witness, a revelation just beyond reach. Flight 21 does not comfortably fit that narrative. Instead, it presents a different kind of reality, one where evidence has already reached its natural limit. Everything that could be learned from the physical world has been learned. What remains belongs to a realm that investigation alone cannot access. Over time, the crash site itself has become more symbol than location. The forest that once held scattered fragments of aluminum and personal belongings has returned to quiet stillness. Nature has reclaimed what was violently interrupted. Trees have grown over the memory of impact. Weather has softened the physical traces of destruction. The land no longer displays what happened there in any visible way, yet it carries the weight of it in historical record and human memory. For those who study aviation safety, the case remains a reminder of how far systems have evolved. Modern security protocols, passenger screening, baggage inspection, and aircraft monitoring all exist in a world shaped by accumulated lessons from tragedies like this one. Even when not directly responsible for specific reforms, cases such as Flight 21 contribute to a broader understanding that aviation safety is not static but continuously constructed through experience, often at great cost. For historians, the case is a study in investigative discipline. It shows how carefully conclusions must be drawn when evidence is strong but incomplete. It demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between probability and proof, between reconstruction and attribution. It highlights the ethical responsibility investigators carry when they resist the pressure to name a culprit without sufficient certainty. For everyone else, it remains something simpler and more difficult at the same time. A story without an ending that satisfies the human need for closure. There is a temptation, in cases like this, to imagine that somewhere the answer still exists in hidden form. That if enough time passed or enough technology developed, the identity of the person responsible might eventually be revealed. But the reality of Flight 21 resists that optimism. The evidence that survives is largely physical, and physical evidence can only describe what happened, not fully explain who chose to make it happen. That distinction defines the case more than anything else. In reflecting on it, what stands out most is not the explosion itself, nor even the mystery that followed, but the silence that remains. A silence that began in the skies over British Columbia and continued through the forests where the aircraft fell, through the investigation that followed, and into the decades that came after. It is a silence shaped by absence of testimony, absence of confession, and absence of legal resolution. Yet within that silence, the victims remain central. They are not defined by the mystery that surrounds their deaths, but by the lives they were living before it occurred. They were passengers on a routine flight, individuals with destinations, responsibilities, relationships, and expectations. Their final journey was not meant to become history. It became history only because something went catastrophically wrong. Remembering them in that context matters more than resolving the identity of the person responsible. Because while the investigation may end in uncertainty, the human reality of the loss does not depend on answers to be meaningful. It stands on its own, independent of the unanswered questions that followed. In the end, Flight 21 leaves behind a dual legacy. On one side, it is a case study in forensic investigation, structural failure analysis, and the limits of criminal attribution when evidence is destroyed and suspects do not survive. On the other, It is a quiet memorial to 52 people whose final moments were shaped by events they never understood and could never control. Some mysteries gradually fade with time as new evidence emerges or attention shifts elsewhere. This one has not faded in the same way. It persists not because it demands solution, but because it refuses simplification. It remains exactly as it is, fully examined yet not fully explained. And perhaps that is the final lesson it leaves behind. That not every story ends with clarity. Not every question receives an answer. And not every tragedy can be closed with a statement of certainty. Some remain, even after decades, suspended in the space between what is known and what will never be known. There is a particular kind of ending that does not feel like an ending at all, and the story of Flight 21 belongs entirely to that space. It does not close with resolution, nor with revelation, nor with the quiet certainty that often follows even the darkest of investigations. Instead, it settles into something more uncomfortable, something that continues to exist long after the final report is filed and the wreckage is removed from the forest floor. It becomes a permanent question mark placed over a moment in time that can never be revisited. For the investigators who worked the case, the final conclusion was never about victory or failure. It was about limits. They had pushed as far as the evidence would allow, following every fragment of physical truth the aircraft left behind. They had reconstructed the breakup sequence, identified the most probable origin of the explosion, and ruled out mechanical failure with a high degree of confidence. In almost every technical sense, they had answered what the aircraft was willing to reveal. But the aircraft could not speak to intention. It could not name a person. It could not explain why. And so the investigation reached a boundary that science alone could not cross. In the years that followed, Flight 21 became something different depending on who was looking at it. To aviation experts, it remained a case study in structural vulnerability and forensic reconstruction. To historians, it was a marker of an era when commercial aviation was expanding faster than its security frameworks. To true crime researchers, it was a haunting example of a perfect crime scene created not by design alone, but by circumstance, destruction, and the passage of time. To families, it remained none of those things. It remained personal. Time did not soften the fact that 52 people left home one afternoon and never returned. It only changed the distance from which that absence was felt. The voices of loved ones, once expected to return by evening or the following morning, became memories preserved in photographs, letters, and fragments of recollection. The airport goodbye became the final moment shared in real time. Everything after that existed only in imagination. One of the most difficult aspects of unresolved tragedies is the way they resist emotional completion. When there is a known perpetrator, grief often evolves into something structured. Anger, justice, legal acknowledgement, and sentencing provide a framework through which loss can be processed. Even when justice is imperfect, it creates a narrative endpoint. Flight 21 never offered that structure. There was no trial, no conviction, no definitive moment where responsibility was placed into the record of law. Instead, responsibility remained suspended in ambiguity. That ambiguity is what has allowed the case to endure in public memory long after many similar tragedies have faded from attention. It is not the scale alone that keeps it alive, but the absence of resolution. Human minds are drawn to incomplete patterns. We instinctively search for missing pieces, even when we are told they may not exist. In that sense, Flight 21 is not just a historical event. It is an unresolved pattern embedded in collective memory. Modern readers encountering the case for the first time often assume that continued investigation must eventually lead to answers. This assumption is natural in a world shaped by technological optimism. We expect that more data will always produce more clarity. Yet Flight 21 stands as a quiet contradiction to that expectation. It demonstrates that information can reach a point of saturation without producing certainty. The evidence can be sufficient to explain what happened, while still being insufficient to explain who caused it. That gap between knowledge and attribution is where the case permanently resides. Over time, as aviation security systems evolved, the environment that allowed such a tragedy to occur became increasingly difficult to replicate. Airports transformed into controlled spaces with layered screening processes. Passenger identities became more thoroughly documented. Baggage handling became more closely monitored. Each advancement reduced the likelihood of undetected threats, but none of them could retroactively solve what had already happened. Flight 21, in that sense, belongs to a transitional moment in history. It sits between an era of trust-based aviation and an era of security-based aviation. Its legacy is not just the tragedy itself, but the shift in understanding it contributed to, along with countless other incidents that collectively reshaped global air travel. Yet even with all these systemic changes, the individual story at the center of Flight 21 remains unchanged. 52 people boarded an aircraft expecting an ordinary journey. Somewhere during that journey, an unseen event occurred that ended all of their lives within moments of each other. The mechanism of that event has been largely understood. The decision behind it has not. That separation is what continues to define the emotional weight of the case. There is a tendency in human storytelling to seek villains because villains provide structure. They allow tragedy to be organized into cause and effect. They allow grief to be directed toward accountability. But Flight 21 refuses that simplification. It resists being reduced into a single identity because no identity was ever confirmed. This resistance is not a flaw in the investigation. It is a reflection of reality as it existed at the time. Not every event leaves behind enough traceable evidence to reconstruct human intent. Some actions dissolve into consequences faster than they can be observed. In the end, what remains is not a solution but a record. A record of a flight that departed in routine conditions and never reached its destination. A record of an aircraft that broke apart in the sky under conditions consistent with an internal explosion. A record of an investigation that worked with diligence, precision, and restraint, yet ultimately reached the edge of what was possible. The final truth of Flight 21 is therefore not a single answer but a layered absence. The absence of survivors who could testify. The absence of a suspect who could be charged. The absence of a confession that could explain motive. And beneath all of that, the absence of closure that time alone cannot replace. What remains instead is memory, carried forward in fragments of documentation and retelling. Each generation that encounters the case inherits not only its facts, but also its unanswered questions. And with each retelling, the same realization returns, unchanged from the first investigators who stood in the forests of British Columbia surrounded by wreckage and silence. Some events can be fully known. Others can only be partially understood. And a few, like Flight 21, remain forever suspended between the two. Not forgotten. Not resolved. Simply enduring, as a reminder that even in an age of investigation, science, and record-keeping, there are still moments in history that refuse to yield their final secret. There is no official Part 11 in the historical record of Flight 21, because history itself does not continue beyond absence. What follows after all the reports, all the reconstructions, and all the conclusions is not new evidence, but the slow accumulation of time over something that refuses to resolve. It is the continuation of a silence that began in the sky above British Columbia in 1965 and has never fully ended. When people return to this case decades later, they often expect that time will have softened it, that distance will have diluted its impact, or that modern knowledge will have filled in the missing pieces. Instead, they encounter something more resistant. The facts remain fixed in place. The aircraft departed, climbed, suffered a catastrophic internal explosion, broke apart in flight, and fell into a remote forest. The investigation determined this with increasing confidence over the years. But the identity of the person responsible never emerged into anything approaching certainty. That absence has become the defining feature of the case. It is not unusual for old investigations to fade into obscurity. Many aviation incidents from the same era are remembered only in technical archives or specialist literature. Flight 21, however, continues to surface in discussions about forensic limits and unresolved criminal acts, not because it is the most famous case of its kind, but because it represents something more uncomfortable. It demonstrates how complete understanding of a physical event does not necessarily lead to understanding of human intent. In modern forensic science, there is an assumption that every mystery has a solution waiting to be uncovered with better tools or more data. Flight 21 challenges that assumption in a quiet but persistent way. The evidence that survives is consistent, carefully analyzed, and largely agreed upon by experts. Yet agreement about what happened does not translate into knowledge of who made it happen. The gap between those two forms of understanding is where the case permanently resides. Over time, that gap has taken on symbolic meaning. It represents the boundary between reconstruction and truth, between inference and proof, between what can be known and what can only be strongly believed. Investigators were able to reconstruct the most likely sequence of events with remarkable clarity for a case of its age. They identified structural failure consistent with an internal blast, they located the probable origin point in the rear section of the aircraft, and they ruled out mechanical malfunction as the primary cause. These conclusions were not speculative in nature. They were grounded in physical evidence that withstood repeated examination. But no amount of reconstruction can produce a name. That limitation is not a failure of effort. It is a consequence of conditions. The destruction of the aircraft occurred in a way that eliminated nearly all opportunities for direct attribution. There were no survivors. There were no external witnesses to the act itself. There were no recovered communications from inside the aircraft that might have captured final interactions. Every human perspective inside the cabin ended at the same moment as the explosion. What remained was the aircraft itself, reduced to fragments spread across a remote landscape. Those fragments could explain mechanics, but not motive. As years passed, the case became part of a broader reflection on how societies process unresolved violence. In cases with identifiable perpetrators, history tends to organize itself into a sequence: event, investigation, trial, judgment, memory. Flight 21 disrupts that sequence by removing the third and fourth steps entirely. Without trial or judgment, memory becomes the only remaining stage, and memory is inherently incomplete when it lacks definitive resolution. For those who study such cases, this incompleteness is not merely emotional. It is structural. It reveals how dependent justice systems are on the presence of a subject who can be held accountable. Without that subject, the system can still document, analyze, and preserve, but it cannot finalize. In the decades since the disaster, occasional renewed interest has surfaced, often driven by advances in forensic technology or by broader investigations into historical aviation incidents. Each time, the same pattern has repeated. New analysis refines understanding of the physical event but does not alter the fundamental conclusion. The aircraft was almost certainly destroyed by an internal explosive device. The device was almost certainly introduced by someone aboard the flight. That person was never identified with sufficient certainty to meet legal standards of proof. The case therefore remains suspended in a state that is neither active nor closed. It exists in archival space, accessible but unresolved, complete in its documentation but incomplete in its meaning. For the public, the absence of a resolution has created a different kind of narrative endurance. Rather than fading, the case persists as a reminder of investigative limitation. It appears in discussions about aviation safety history, in studies of unsolved crimes, and in broader reflections on how modern systems deal with uncertainty. It is not remembered because it offers closure, but because it denies it. That denial is what gives the case its lasting weight. Human psychology resists unfinished stories. There is a natural impulse to imagine hidden answers, overlooked evidence, or future discoveries that might finally bring clarity. Yet Flight 21 does not comfortably accommodate that impulse. The evidence that remains is extensive enough to support strong conclusions about mechanism, but not sufficient to extend those conclusions into identification of responsibility. Every investigative path that was viable has already been explored within the constraints of available information. What remains is not hidden truth waiting to be found, but absence that has already been fully mapped. And yet, within that absence, the human dimension of the tragedy continues to hold its place. The 52 individuals aboard the aircraft were not defined by the mystery that followed their deaths. They were defined by the lives they were living before it. Their presence in the story is not contingent on the resolution of the investigation. It exists independently of it. They boarded a flight that was expected to be routine. They moved through a world that had not yet changed. They experienced a final hour that, for them, was indistinguishable from any other flight until the moment it was not. That reality remains unchanged regardless of what is known or unknown about the cause. In reflecting on Flight 21 today, what emerges is not a solution but a perspective. It is a recognition that some events cannot be fully resolved within the boundaries of evidence, no matter how carefully that evidence is preserved or analyzed. It is also a reminder that the absence of an answer does not erase the validity of the investigation that sought it. The work done on this case established a level of understanding that remains significant even without identification of the perpetrator. It clarified what happened to the aircraft with considerable precision. It eliminated alternative explanations that might otherwise have persisted. It preserved a record that continues to inform how similar incidents are approached in the present day. These contributions exist independently of the unresolved question of identity. In the end, Flight 21 remains exactly where it has been for decades. Not in the category of solved cases, and not in the category of active investigations, but in a quieter and more difficult category altogether. It is a case defined by knowledge that stops just short of completion, by evidence that explains events but not intentions, and by a truth that is partial not because it was missed, but because it was never fully recoverable. And so the final reflection it leaves behind is not a revelation, but a recognition. That understanding has limits. That justice requires conditions that are not always present. And that some stories, no matter how thoroughly examined, end not with answers, but with the enduring presence of everything that remains unknown. If there is a final way to understand Flight 21, it is not through the search for what remains missing, but through the acknowledgement of what has already been permanently established. The aircraft was destroyed in flight. The destruction originated from within. The structural failure was consistent with an internal explosive event. The sequence of breakup, descent, and impact has been reconstructed with enough precision that few experts dispute its broad outline. These are the facts that time has not altered. What time has altered is everything surrounding those facts. The names of most of the 52 people aboard are no longer widely remembered outside archival records and family histories. The flight number itself survives more readily than the individual identities of those who died on it, a reversal that is common in large-scale tragedies. Numbers endure because they are easy to preserve. Lives require active remembrance. Over decades, unless deliberately revisited, they slowly recede from public awareness even when the event itself remains historically significant. Yet within families and personal histories, nothing about that disappearance is abstract. It is fixed, specific, and unchanging. A seat that was once filled remains permanently empty. A conversation that was expected never took place. A return that was anticipated never arrived. These are not elements of investigation. They are elements of lived experience, and they do not depend on forensic conclusions to retain meaning. In the broader context of aviation history, Flight 21 occupies a position defined less by fame than by consequence. It stands as one of those cases that quietly influenced how investigators think about destruction events that leave limited human evidence. It reinforced the importance of structural analysis in determining causes when eyewitness testimony is unavailable. It demonstrated how chemical traces, fracture patterns, and debris distribution can collectively reconstruct events that no living person observed in full. But it also demonstrated something more difficult. That even the most careful reconstruction has boundaries. Those boundaries are not failures of intelligence or effort. They are conditions imposed by circumstance. When a catastrophic event destroys both the mechanism and the witnesses simultaneously, the investigative process must rely entirely on indirect evidence. That evidence can describe physical reality with increasing clarity, but it cannot reach into the realm of intention, decision, or identity unless something survives that connects them. In Flight 21, Nothing survived that connection. Over time, this absence has given the case a particular kind of permanence. It does not evolve. It does not resolve. It does not change with new interpretations in any meaningful way. Each revisit to the case returns to the same fixed points. The aircraft departed. The explosion occurred. The structure failed. The crash followed. The investigation concluded that sabotage was highly likely. The responsible individual was never identified. This repetition is not redundancy. It is the structure of the case itself. There are cases that grow with time as new evidence emerges or perspectives shift. Flight 21 does not belong to that category. It belongs to a smaller group of events that are defined by the stability of their unknowns. In such cases, additional time does not produce new answers. It only deepens the understanding of what cannot be recovered. Modern readers often encounter the case through summaries, documentaries, or analytical reconstructions that attempt to bring clarity to historical uncertainty. These retellings serve an important purpose. They preserve knowledge that might otherwise fade. They contextualize the event within broader developments in aviation safety and forensic science. They help ensure that the tragedy is not reduced to a forgotten entry in a database. But no retelling can alter the fundamental structure of the case. There is no final revelation waiting beyond the existing record. There is no hidden archive that completes the missing portion of the story. There is only the same sequence of verified events and the same absence at its center. That absence has, over time, become its own form of significance. It represents the limits of reconstruction when human intent is destroyed along with physical evidence. It reflects the reality that not all questions in forensic investigation are designed to be answered, even when the physical mechanisms of an event can be fully understood. And yet, despite this limitation, the investigation into Flight 21 was not without meaning. On the contrary, it demonstrated the value of disciplined inquiry in the absence of certainty. Investigators did not speculate beyond what evidence allowed. They did not force conclusions where proof was insufficient. They documented what could be known and clearly distinguished it from what could not. That discipline preserved the integrity of the case and ensured that its conclusions remain respected even decades later. In doing so, they created a record that continues to inform how similar cases are approached. Not by offering a solution, but by defining a method. A method grounded in careful observation, structural analysis, and restraint in interpretation. From a human perspective, however, the most enduring aspect of Flight 21 remains separate from methodology or forensic detail. It is the quiet persistence of absence. The absence of return. The absence of explanation. The absence of closure. These are not technical categories. They are emotional realities that do not diminish with time or analysis. They remain exactly as they were on the day the aircraft disappeared into the forests of British Columbia. In the end, Flight 21 does not conclude in the way narratives are expected to conclude. It does not resolve into certainty or transform into a fully explained account of cause and intent. Instead, it remains in a stable condition of partial knowledge, fully understood in its physical outcome, permanently unknown in its human origin. That condition is what defines it. Not mystery as spectacle. Not investigation as drama. But limitation as reality. And so the final understanding of Flight 21 is not that something remains to be discovered, but that something has already been permanently lost beyond the reach of discovery. The aircraft, the moment of explosion, the sequence of structural failure, and the descent into the forest can all be described with increasing precision. The identity and intention behind that moment cannot. This is where the case rests. Not unresolved in the sense of incomplete effort, but unresolved in the sense of irrecoverable origin. And in that distinction lies its final meaning. Not as a puzzle awaiting completion, but as a record of what remains when completion is no longer possible.